The Koppel Report. A national town meeting. The legalization of drugs.
It may be the most effective, if least popular, solution to our nation's drug problem. It is, without question, the most controversial. What would happen if we legalized marijuana, cocaine, even heroin? ABC News correspondents and our affiliates have been compiling answers to that question for months.
Heed the lessons of prohibition and treat drugs as a national health problem, not as a crime problem.
By legalizing drugs in our state, or in Louisiana, period, I think it would destroy our society.
Crack produces the most dramatic cocaine high since the drug reaches the brain almost instantly. It is therefore highly addictive.
Nice thing, though, cocaine. What a wonderful drug. Anything that makes you paranoid and impotent, give me more of that.
You sell hash in different size bags?
Yes. Small bags, bigger bags. You want to see a few?
Yeah. If a candidate were to support decriminalization of drugs, that candidate is not likely to win. Period.
It's not tough enough. I am not kidding you when I said that I feel we need a law to shoot them. And I'm sponsoring such a law, and I mean it.
Good evening. I'm Ted Koppel, reporting tonight from New York with our national town meeting on the legalization of drugs. We are joined, as you can see, by a live audience. We'll be taking some of their questions and comments, and some of you will be able to interact with us also. Those of you watching this program on television will see a toll-free number on your screen. I should point out that we're also being joined tonight by a national radio audience. For their benefit, let me read that telephone number. It is 1-800-648-8094. I'll repeat that number, 1-800-648-8094. I'll be repeating that number later in the broadcast. What our television audience is seeing now are the faces of and a list with the names of all the panelists and guests who will be joining us throughout the course of this evening. We wanted to be sure that no matter which aspect of the legalization subject comes up, we will have at least one guest who can address the issue. So much for the introduction. Now, let's begin. What we have here are two of America's most popular, and it should be added, most addictive drugs: alcohol and cigarettes. And there are two significant characteristics that distinguish these drugs from drugs on which we'll be focusing most of our attention tonight. First of all, they are perfectly legal, at least for adults. And secondly, perhaps only because they are legal, they are more lethal than all the other drugs combined. Alcohol is responsible for the deaths of approximately 100,000 of our fellow citizens every year. And these things, cigarettes, kill approximately 350,000 Americans annually. By contrast, all the illegal drugs combined killed a relatively modest 5,000 to 6,000 Americans last year. That, of course, does not begin to make the case for legalization of all those other drugs, but we wanted to begin this evening's discussion by presenting some of the arguments for legalization. We asked correspondent Jeff Greenfield to do just that, and here's his report.
Hit it. Top, Larry. Top.
Go, go!
Call them images of war.
Police, search warrant, open the door! Now lay down, right there.
Pursuing the merchants of drugs at home.
You got any more drugs on you?
And those that use them.
Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law.
Battling the armies that war in our streets for the right to sell the contraband.
We got a post,
Counting the victims cut down in the combat over drug turf.
I'm going to put 3 officers on board your vessel.
Struggling against the invasion by sea, by land, by air. All this, we are told, are costs and casualties of this so-called war on drugs. But the news from the front makes it clear that this is a war we cannot win.
She was the innocent victim of a bullet allegedly fired by a gang member at arrival.
This could happen again. This is a walking time bomb. This area is a walking time bomb. It really is. And even the children, they have guns.
Getting complaints about drug dealing here in the corner.
In Minneapolis, drugs are openly sold on the streets.
I'm here to tell you that all of the action in Minneapolis or elsewhere is just a spinning a wheel and chasing of our own tails. It ain't working.
In Baltimore, the prisons are overflowing.
We have a prison system in the state of Maryland that was designed to hold 9,500 people. It has 14,000 in there now, and an enormous percentage of them are in there because of drug-related activity.
Attempted criminal sale of controlled substances.
From New York to Miami, drug cases clogged the courts.
Last year in the Southern District of Florida, 472 cases went to trial. 85% of those cases were drug cases.
And a tidal wave of drug profits corrupt cops, prosecutors, even judges. And for all of our efforts, the American drug appetite remains insatiable. Last year, we spent as much as $140 billion on illegal drugs, which are cheaper and more plentiful than they were at the start of the decade. All of this is why the once unthinkable is now increasingly heard, that it is time to recognize the futile, self-defeating nature of this so-called war and face the truth. It is time to legalize drugs. The mayor of Baltimore put the idea on the table earlier this year.
Let's take the profit out of drug trafficking. And how do we do that? Well, I believe that one way is to heed the lessons of prohibition and treat drugs as a national health problem, not as a crime problem.
Conservatives like Ernest Vandenhaag support it.
I'm all in favor of punishing severely those who violate the law. But I am in favor of changing the law when it is clear that the law does not achieve its purpose.
The head of a drug policy think tank uses history as a guide.
As bad as alcohol was, prohibition was worse. As bad as all these drugs are now, cocaine, heroin, crack, marijuana, prohibition is worse.
If you don't teach your kids to say no to drugs, it's as good as saying yes.
So intense is our concern over drugs that legalization may sound like surrender to crime and moral decay. But proponents say, wait, look at what legalization would do. The problem? We spend as much as $8 billion a year to fight drug-related crime, $2 billion more to imprison those we catch. A government-run distribution program, advocates say, could cut enforcement costs by as much as 75%, saving some $3.5 billion a year as addicts no longer steal to feed their habit.
They will no longer have a motive to do so because they can get the stuff relatively cheaply at drugstores or wherever, liquor stores, wherever it is going to be sold.
The problem, gangs and organized crime. Their power, say some, stems from the huge profits derived from selling now illegal drugs. Making drugs legally available, say advocates, could wipe out as much as 90% of this narcotics traffic, some $24 billion a year.
I'm trying to eliminate a problem. I'm trying to get rid of pushers the way the criminal justice system has not been able to get rid of pushers.
The problem, wholesale corruption of law enforcement here and governments abroad. Legalize drugs and you wipe out the illegal profits and the incentive to bribe cops and judges and to undermine the very stability of friendly governments abroad.
There have been assassinations of Colombian cabinet members and judges that have come from the U.S. effort to minimize the flow of drugs out of those countries.
The problem, a nation of some 25 million chronic drug users, many of whom can't or won't get treatment. Taxing drugs could yield anywhere from $14 to $42 billion a year by one estimate, money that could be used to provide treatment and anti-drug education on a massive scale.
Use the revenues that come from it in a healthy social way, probably to teach people, as we did with alcohol and we've done increasingly successfully with cigarettes, that there are certain things you do to yourself as a consequence of your own behavior that are damaging.
Move! With legalization, say advocates, our police would be freed to go after the murderers, rapists, and robbers. Our courts and prisons would have space for the violent offenders. Our treatment centers and drug programs would have the funds to fight drugs. Our law enforcement system and our allies would be freed from corruption. And we would finally have turned away from the current policies which have failed utterly.
We know right now that what we've got is a disaster. Any fool can see that the current policy is a disaster.
Would legalizing drugs really make things any better out here? That, say proponents, is not the point. If we keep going as we are, they say, things will only get worse. Jeff Greenfield, ABC News, New York.
I am hopeful that certain blood pressures very close to me are rising rapidly right now. One of them, I suspect, William Von Rad, Director of Customs of U.S. Customs, and also, I might add, the architect of the administration's zero-tolerance policy, which is aimed at penalizing all persons caught with even small amounts of illegal drugs. Commissioner Von Raab, we have just heard that, in fact, despite the policy of this administration to try and keep drugs out, in point of fact, particularly with cocaine, the amount of cocaine that's been coming into this country over the past 5 years has been increasing year after year after year after year, which would suggest that your policy isn't working.
Well, first of all, I think that maybe the topic that we're discussing here is wrong. The issue isn't whether we should legalize drugs or not. It's whether we should recriminalize drugs. What we saw in the 70s was a continuing period of lessening of the laws against drugs and a weakening of the American people's attitude by constant reports about how drugs really wouldn't hurt you, decriminalizing marijuana possession, all sorts of things that literally led us down into 1980 in a situation in which we had an epidemic on our hand. That's what we're dealing with. That's what we're trying to change.
Commissioner, you've still got an epidemic on your hands, and with all due respect, we are going to talk about the legalization of drugs tonight. That's what we're here to do. My question to you is, if after 7.5 years of a rather tough Reagan administration policy, the quantity of cocaine is going up rather than going down, explain to me why that does not represent a failed policy.
There are many aspects to this policy. The most important aspect of our drug policy is the attitude of the American people. Every man and woman discussing the issue would agree that proper education and conditioning of the American people is what counts. What we need is a changed attitude. It's starting to change.
Okay, let me point out, first of all, that I'm going to be introducing each of our panelists as we go to them, but I told you that we would be joined also by phone calls from our audience. We're going to go to our first phone call now from Chicago. Chicago, go ahead. Hello, Chicago. Can you hear me, or have you hung up on us already? Chicago? Okay, never mind. Bill Buckley, I must confess I was a little surprised when I heard initially, and when I read that first column of yours, in which you suggested a rather sympathetic point of view toward the notion of legalizing drugs. Why? You've always been regarded as a rather conservative fellow.
Well, let me introduce my point, if I may.
And if you would come in a little closer.
By saying that I don't think that people ought to be permitted to buy drugs because people ought to be permitted to do anything they want to do. When I ran for mayor of New York, I came out very, very strongly against the legalization of drugs, making, among other points, that it is not a pain inflicted only on yourself, it's inflicted on your family and on your society. I think, however, empirical data are now overwhelming. You just rehearsed them for 5 minutes here, and I don't need to illuminate. I might say that there are 27,000 cargo planes in the world today. One cargo plane is enough to satisfy the current consumption of cocaine in the United States for an entire year. So I'm in favor of legalizing, subject to making a simultaneous point, which is very important. And that is that anybody who sells drugs to minors will be executed. I think that we are entitled to believe that as far as minors are concerned, they have to be taught. And that anybody who wants to specialize in the kind of brain mutilation that goes with taking drugs and sells it to minors ought to be subject to the capital punishment penalty. Simultaneously, therefore, you're giving two signals. Number one, if you're 21 years old or over, there's no way we can keep you from getting drugs. You can get them today, tomorrow, next day, a year from now. But you get caught selling to minors, and you go to the electric chair if you're convicted.
Let me turn to the one man on this panel who has to submit himself to the vote of his particular public. In this case, he is the mayor of the city of Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke. We heard you briefly, Mr. Mayor. You have come out in favor of at least discussing openly the issue of legalization. Possibly you were even in favor of legalization itself. I want to have a sense, what has the public reaction been? We took a poll which indicates that roughly 90% of the American public is opposed to legalization. How has that been reflected in Baltimore?
Yeah, I think that's correct, Ted. The point is that we wanted to start a discussion, a debate, to let people know that this was not a crazy idea, that basically we were saying, and what I've been saying is that alcohol prohibition was a failure in this country for a variety of reasons, and we've now gone through 74 years of drug prohibition, and it too has been a failure. And rather than continue existing policies which are failed, let's open ourselves up to alternatives. Look at other countries, what they are doing. Look at the past history and try to come up with a more flexible policy that essentially treats this more as a health problem than a crime problem. And basically, you know, I've been a soldier in this war on drugs. I was a prosecutor. I had one of the highest conviction rates on narcotics of any prosecutor in big cities. And I've seen the failure, however, of the criminal justice system. And I would like us to now debate seriously whether we should let the Surgeon General lead the war rather than the Attorney General.
Mr. Mayor, we're going to have to take a break. Let me first of all point out we still have two distinguished members of our panel, the Reverend Jesse Jackson and Professor Ethan Nadelman of Princeton University, who will be joining us when we come back. We will be taking, I hope, some phone calls that will get all the way through. We will be involving members of our audience in the discussion, and we'll have a surprise or two when we come back.
The Koppel Report. A national town meeting. The legalization of drugs is brought to you by AT&T in long-distance services.
AT&T has just made Watts a whole new ballgame for any size business.
Yo, I got smoke here. Good smoke. Reefer.
No thanks. You know, it's hard to believe, but I used to buy my pot like that. Of course, that was before legalization. Now, I smoke Acapulco Golds. With Golds, I know what I'm getting. No stems, no seeds, just 100% government-regulated marijuana buds with that mellow Acapulco Gold high. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go for the gold.
Acapulco Gold, now in pouch and pre-rolled. The Surgeon General warns that marijuana may be psychologically addictive and could cause short-term memory loss, and in some men, lower testosterone levels. Traces remain in urine up to 6 days.
Well, I hope you can tell the difference between a real commercial and a satire, but Professor Ethan Nadelman of Princeton, you who believe that legalization would be such a good idea, if it is, that may be only a few months behind.
Well, Ted, I don't really think that legalization is such a great idea. In fact, in many ways, it may be a terrible idea. It's just that it's probably a lot better than the current policy. And that's really what it boils down to. Nobody's saying that legalization is going to solve the drug abuse problem in this country. But what it is going to solve is a whole lot of other problems that people identify as part and parcel of the drug problem. That's what's really important. I mean, the current system is one in which the drug dealers control the business. It's one in which they tax it, one in which they regulate, they determine who sells it, to some extent who buys it, price, purity, you name it. I'm saying there's a lot better policy, and it's one in which the government plays a strong role in doing that rather than the criminal.
Jesse Jackson, your brow is furrowed and you're ready to dive in. You don't agree?
Because I think the legalization issue is absurd. I think it is sick. Because you're talking about shifting from jails to hospitals and graveyards. It mistakes the point that you're legalizing poison that destroys the mind, the body, the motor functions, and corrupts the soul. And so the issue is not tough policy or tender policy, it's comprehensive policy. Cut the supply of drugs as well as fight with education to the man for the drugs.
Or one might argue a more intelligent policy, or at least a more thinking policy. Now, we've struck the set over there with the bottle of booze that I had and the pack of cigarettes, but the point of fact is, if what we're worried about is the number of Americans who are killed every year, we are killing almost 100 times as many Americans with the combination of alcohol and cigarettes than we are with all the combined deaths from marijuana, from crack, from cocaine, from PCPs, from heroin.
Two things, Ted. One, if cocaine, crack, and heroin were as available as scotch and bourbon and cigarettes, you would then have a fair comparison. The fact is, coke and crack and heroin are much more deadly. But the second fact is that the legalizing of liquor and cigarettes have failed. The data you shows that it's failed. The fact is, when we had liquor on the ground, rather than engaging in mass education, we used liquor as anesthesia for our pain. And now we have data now that shows that liquor kills and cigarettes kills. And so to that extent, it's so pervasive now, we can't stop it. All we can do is deal with the demands that we saw. It's dangerous. Don't try it. Cut the demand. Don't stop while you're young. We lost the supply struggle. Now we're on the demand struggle. I say, as for coke, crack, and heroin, let's fight supply and demand while we have a chance.
Let me just quickly go to a phone call, see if we can make it work this time. Dubuque, Iowa, can you hear us?
Yes.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Now, since cocaine kills and marijuana has not proven to be physically addictive, then why not just legalize marijuana and not cocaine?
Bill Buckley, you want to take a crack at that?
Well, I think that there is a distinction, and I think that the point Mr. Nadelman made is correct, that unhappily that distinction is now made by the people who sell the stuff. When does marijuana become hash? And when does hash become whatever? This is not something that is nowadays dictated by any standards set by Washington agency. But it's quite true that what you say about heroin ought not to be said about marijuana, because harmful though it is relatively harmless.
I want to include now members of our audience. Go ahead, sir. You have some personal experience.
Yes, my name's Al Zolak. I'm a former professional basketball player, and I turned to cocaine after the death of my mother, and it was for a 2-week escape, and it turned into 7 years of living hell. These people who are thinking about legalizing drugs haven't felt the pain that I went through as a drug addict, the pain I'm going through as a recovering drug addict, and also how it affects family members. This young lady right here, I do some speaking in the public schools in the South Jersey area, and education, I can see, is working. I can see the circle of non-using kids growing. This young lady right here came up to me after I was finished speaking, and she doesn't do drugs. But as an 11-year-old, to have someone come up to you, start shaking and shivering in front of you, start crying and coming up and putting her arms around your neck and saying, please help my uncle from not dying, please help my uncle from not dying. And these people want to legalize this stuff?
Well, now, wait a second. You see, again, we are in danger, I think, of confusing the question of legalizing with somehow suggesting that they want to increase the use. Legalization is being proposed, at least in the context of this program, as I understand it, as something that is more effective, Professor Nadelman, at least, than what is happening right now. It is illegal right now to use marijuana, coke, crack, cocaine, heroin, PCPs, and yet it is being used all over the country, isn't it?
We have to stricken the laws. You know, it's
Make them stricter?
Sure, because if I come up and I shoot somebody, they don't say, how many bullets did you have in the gun? Just like what they say is, okay, well, you can have 14 grams of cocaine and not go to jail. If you're in possession of a drug, it's illegal and you should go to jail. It shouldn't be a matter of how much that you have.
Mr. Von Raab?
We're missing a point here, and that is we're accepting everything that was presented in the first 6 minutes as fact. Most of it's wrong. And the basic thing that's wrong is, one, some theory that somehow addiction and use is not going to go up if you legalize it. It's probably going to go up by 3 or 4 times because the drugs are so appealing. The second thing that's wrong is somehow this theory that crime is going to go away if we legalize it. People have no notion of what the conspiracies are, what the criminal organizations are that are selling this. They're not going to go away. They're just going to enter the legal market in their same way. They'll elbow everyone out until you finally have to get to the point where the government literally is going to have to compete with the crooks.
I didn't know the mafia was in control of the cigarette industry today.
And what you're doing, you're going to shift the drug flow from street hoods to corporate hoods, who then have another level of authority. And with a high degree of social acceptance, you'll see advertisements on TV saying, if you think coke will get you high, try mainlining. I mean, there'll be a competition for who can kill us the fastest rise, and the quickest fall.
Tell you what,
we'll deal with that which kills people.
Bill, if you would both hold it for just 1 second, forgive me, we have to take a break. When we come back, I promise we will go to Bill Buckley. We have a gentleman waiting over here. We have much more to discuss, as you can tell, only just beginning to scratch the surface. We'll be back with more in a moment.
The Koppel Report. The legalization of drugs will continue in a moment.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up
sound. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source. Expect the world of ABC News.
Nicotine is a chemical contained in the leaves of the tobacco plant. When inhaled, it reaches the brain in 7 to 10 seconds, twice as fast as intravenous drugs. In the brain, nicotine acts as a stimulant, but may also have a calming effect, releasing substances in the body called endorphins. Elsewhere, blood vessels constrict, heart rate goes up, and blood pressure increases. Nicotine and tars and carbon monoxide are responsible for the health hazards associated with smoking. In the U.S. alone, 350,000 deaths a year are attributed to smoking. Heart attacks, lung cancer, and emphysema are the 3 top killers. During the smoker's day, the body develops a tolerance for nicotine, so the initial effects that smokers experience are lessened. This year, the Surgeon General released a report stating that nicotine is as addicting as heroin and cocaine.
We are back live once again, and I would like to remind our radio audience that if you want to call in, the 800 number that you can call is 1-800-648-8094. Now, Bill Buckley, the curious thing is, when we talk about mortality, and we just saw Tim Johnson's little glossary item on nicotine, we're killing 350,000 Americans every year, so the mortality rate is enormous. It is an addictive drug. We seem to be getting something of a hold over it, not because we have criminalized it, but because we have educated the American public to finally understand that smoking is really not good for them.
Yeah, I think you're making an important point. If we get nothing out of the outer night, I would hope we'd emancipate ourselves from the superstition that that which is legal is necessarily honorable. My old friend Mr. Jackson seems to suggest that. And it's perfectly legal to contract syphilis, but it doesn't mean that society is in favor of syphilis. As a matter of fact, it's perfectly legal to vote for Jesse Jackson. It doesn't make it reputable, does it? So we're not talking about conferring a social sanction on taking drugs. We're talking about how to cope with the drug problem. Now, it seems to me that the same society that says we're going to execute anybody who sells this to minors can hardly be mistaken for society that is morally indifferent to the consumption of these drugs.
Let me see, before war breaks out on the two wings of this panel, let me see if we can at least find agreement, Mr. Jackson, on the tough point that Mr. Buckley made, namely the point of execution of dealers. You think that would be helpful?
No, that's not a solution, because that's being macho and tough, but it's not being comprehensive. There are 2 dimensions, it seems to me. One, to legalize drugs means the government is going to control it, exact taxes from it, and make money from the distribution of it. And that puts the government, in my judgment, off of the ethical, moral dimension of its obligation.
May I stop you just on that point? Because I'd be interested in understanding the distinction in your mind between that and a government which subsidizes the growing of tobacco when it full well knows that many people are killed every year by smoking cigarettes.
Well, in a real sense, the government is making a concession to politics.
But it's the same thing.
When in fact what we ought to be doing is offering alternative crops for those farmers and the development of the rural economy. I submit to you that the case is now in that smoking kills and that alcohol kills, and we're somewhat addicted to the relationship, and now we only say cut the demand for it, but we know that it's wrong. Now the Surgeon General says it's as dangerous as cocaine and heroin. So we got to stop it.
No, he says it's as addictive as cocaine and heroin. And did I hear you correctly? You say the case is not in that cigarette smoking?
The case is in.
Oh, the case is in.
The case is in. That in a real sense, we are just now realizing the danger of the poison of the nicotine. The case is now. We once thought it was recreational.
We've known it for 25 years, Mr. Jackson. I mean, the Surgeon General first came out with that back in, I think, 1962.
Sometimes we're slow to respond to danger. Slavery, for example, we knew it for a long time was wrong. We were just slow to react to that which made good sense. We knew for a long time denying public accommodation the right to vote on race was wrong. We were just slow, kind of retarded. And now I'm saying that leadership must address it. If cigarettes kill, we can try to educate to stop the smoking and yet not hurt the tobacco farmer as a person. Or if alcohol kills, we must now look for a way to divert people to that which is satisfying without being self-destructive. I would hate for our government to legalize and therefore give some moral and ethical credence to cocaine, crack, and heroin.
Okay, we have a question on microphone.
I agree with Jesse, but the problem in our country is that we don't have the will to say no. We keep telling our kids, just say no. You have to, for me, I was on drugs and I couldn't say no until I had to deal with my own personal conscience. And when I came to the point of repenting for myself that this was wrong for me and my family and society, then I reached out to a higher source, a greater resource than myself, and that was God. And Jesus Christ changed my life. Then I came back into the area where I grew up in Washington Heights, which is the crack capital. And I began to work there. And people are getting changed, not because we know education, they can read right on the package. It says don't smoke it, you're gonna get cancer from it or you're gonna get sick from it, but people keep doing it because...
Yeah, but it's, I mean, forgive me for interrupting you, it's beginning to work. I mean, I don't know precisely what the figures are, perhaps Professor Nadelman does, but over the past 10 years or so, smoking of cigarettes has, as a consequence not of criminalization but of education, has gone down significantly in this country. Do you happen to know what the numbers are?
No, that's true, but it's from about 40%.
Can you come in a little closer?
It's about from 40% to 30% of all Americans it's gone down that ratio.
Well, there's 20 million alcoholics. It's legal. Well, between 15 and 20 are the statistics. It's legal. If we legalize cocaine, the 6 million that is the low figure is going to shoot right on up, and a lot of people that don't use drugs will try it because it's legal.
Let me try and go.
Legalizing alcohol was thought to be a way of reducing the use because of supply and demand. It increased the use. In the sense, if you legalize coke, crack, and heroin, if the object is to get high as anesthesia for your pain, whatever the case may be, it's going to increase the use of it. What are its effects? Babies born addicted. What are its effects? People driving cars on the wrong side of the road. What are its effects? Destroying families. So at least in the case of liquor, the case is in, so we're now trying to run it back into where it was.
But
in the case of crack, coke, and heroin, I say, let's do our best.
Mr. Jackson, you make an eloquent case, and indeed everything you were just saying about cocaine or crack, you could have substituted the word liquor in there. What I don't hear...
No, except for addiction rates. Addiction rates on liquor are much different.
I'm sorry, what?
Only 10% of the people that use alcohol will become addicted. 90% of the people that use tobacco or cocaine will become addicted. That's a major difference between alcohol and drugs.
And Ted, can I say one more thing?
Go ahead.
What kind of message are we sending to young people? What are we telling young people when we, for 20 years, have been saying, drugs is wrong, it's no good, it's illegal, it kills, we're all over television, just say no, and now we're talking about it's okay. What is the government's message?
Who says it's okay?
Well, you know, this is what's coming across when you legalize marijuana, which really this is what it's all about. When you legalize marijuana, it's going to lead into every other drug, and I have to sit there and talk to the broken homes, the people that pluck their eyes out because they went off on some drug. Now, those are the kids that are going to get hurt.
You make one point, and forgive me for interrupting because we're going to have to take another break. You make one point that I want to follow up on, and we will right after the commercial, and that is that our society does indeed delivers some very, very mixed signals on drugs, on cigarettes, on alcohol. We're going to take a look at some of those mixed signals, and we'll do that immediately after these messages, right after this.
The Couple Report, the legalization of drugs, will continue in a moment.
Channel 7 News at 6.
A national town meeting, the legalization of drugs. Once again, live from New York, Ted Koppel.
Several times already during the course of this program, the issue of mixed signals has come up. Some drugs are legal in our society, other drugs are not. We asked correspondent Judd Rose to do a report on some of the mixed signals that are sent. Here now is that report. All right. I'm told that that report is currently on hold, so we're going to go back to the panel. Talk to me for a moment, if you would, Mr. Buckley, about mixed signals, and then Kurt Schmoke, I'd like to come back to you on it.
Well, I think that the principal one was touched on, the paradox of inveighing against the use of tobacco while subsidizing its use. I mean, our dear friend Jesse Helms, our other Jesse friend, has trouble with that. Mr. Jackson's correct that this is simply one of the political ambushes that we set for ourselves. But we ought really, I think, to resist the notion that we approve of the use of cigarettes because we subsidize North Carolina tobacco farmers. This is simply a paradox that we've got into socially. But I repeat the necessity to free ourselves from the superstition that that which is legal is, for that reason, something we approve of.
Let me interrupt you, and we're going to go in just a moment to that report on mixed signals, because I think it'll be a little bit helpful to us in seeing a little bit of the hypocrisy with which our society deals with subjects like this. But Mayor Schmoke, I'd like to get a reaction from you, first of all, on what we've been discussing over the last few minutes. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, and we're already sending some terrible mixed signals to our children. For example, we've been saying that the criminal justice system can take care of this problem. But the signal that we see are drug dealers replacing other drug dealers, people getting tremendous profits out of this and becoming role models for far too many of our kids, and a criminal justice system utterly unable to get rid of these drug pushers. And what I would hope is that we wouldn't completely dismiss this decriminalization out of hand when we know that our existing policies have failed and will continue to fail unless we come up with a more flexible approach. And there have been other societies that have gone to drug maintenance programs, opiate maintenance programs to deal with their addicts, for example, that we can't do under our existing criminal law, treating the addicts as patients rather than criminals. And
I want to stop you, Mr. Mayor, if I may.
I'm just saying, open up their minds to more flexibility, because we may not be right, but what the current situation is definitely wrong and will continue to fail.
You were leading us just in the direction that I wanted to go on the question of mixed signals. Once again, Judd Rose is our reporter. Here now finally is that report.
Imagine a world where teenagers smoke pot in school, a world where famous people, role models for the young, pass drugs around like hors d'oeuvres, a world where drug dealers lead the good life, live in splendid homes, throw wild parties. This isn't some future world of legalized drugs. This is now, the world according to Hollywood.
Charles, what is that? Peyote.
In this scene from the current film Young Guns, the stars, many of them popular with young fans, take peyote and hallucinate in the wilderness. In this music video, the popular Beastie Boys extol the virtues of angel dust, crack, and more. The law says drugs are illegal, but real life often says otherwise, and as always, art imitates life.
That was my skull. I'm so wasted.
It saddens me that my old industry, the movie industry, hasn't gotten its act together and really begun to combat drug abuse.
In fact, Hollywood is beginning to clean up its act. Gone are the days when a toke was a joke.
Is that a joint, man? That guy there looks like a quarter pounder, man.
Drugs just aren't funny anymore, so the easy jokes and the gratuitous references are mostly gone. Instead, we get films with a message.
Can you stay clean for 1 week? For 1 damn week? I could try.
Less Than Zero and Bright Lights Big City are typical cautionary tales designed to appeal to the changing attitudes of the audience.
If the society feels that drugs are no longer cool, then the movies have to respond to that by also saying that drugs aren't cool.
Responding to society, that's what Hollywood's been doing for many years. When America thought smoking was chic, so did Hollywood. And long before anyone considered the hazards of drinking, movie stars got their kicks from champagne. By the 60s, drugs had entered the mainstream of society, and in the movies, it showed.
This is grass. You mean marijuana? Yeah.
This was a sign of those times, in the same way anti-drug films are a sign of these times. This is a scene from Wired, a film due out soon about the drug-fueled fall of John Belushi. Sid and Nancy is about the drug habit that destroyed Sid Vicious. The images here are bleak, but many anti-drug movies make the lifestyle look exciting, thereby promoting the very behavior they condemn.
Kids are more likely to remember that image, the $100 bill rolled up or something like that, or the spreading out of the line, than they are anything else if the movie isn't any good.
Do anti-drug movies send a mixed message? Well, let's take a look. In Less Than Zero, Robert Downey is a junkie, but he goes to the best parties. In Bright Lights, Michael J. Fox has a coke problem, but no problem picking up women at hip night spots. In Wall Street, Charlie Sheen is heading for prison, but the ride looks like fun. Confronted with that, Hollywood would perhaps point to a current film that's anything but glamorous.
And I got this startling belief that I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict.
Clean and Sober is a great example of the turnaround Hollywood has made. I think that it's a anti-drug movie rather than a pro-drug movie.
But for every Clean and Sober, there are others like Cocktail.
That kind of film really turns out to be an unintended argument for let's go back and get blasted. And then, of course, the part that they never show is these kids get into cars, go on the highway, and are lethal objects aimed at you and me.
If Hollywood seems ambivalent about substance abuse, it's only reflecting the ambivalence in society. This is one case where legalization won't make any difference. From smoking to drinking to drugs, it's not the laws, but the mood of the times that sets the tone. That's just good business. And in Hollywood, the line that matters most of all is the bottom line. Judd Rose, ABC News, New York.
And we will be discussing some of the cultural impact, and indeed sometimes our music and our books and our records and the movies and the television programs that we see have more of an impact than all the discussions of this nature that we're having. So more on that a little bit later. Just a reminder, we're coming to you live from the ABC Broadcast Center in New York, and we'll be back live in just a moment.
Folks, for dentures that feel fresh as a morning breeze, try my Mint Fresh Polident.
The legalization of drugs. The Koppel Report. Once again, Ted Koppel.
And I'd like to go once again to our audience. Go ahead, sir. You have a question or a comment?
Yes, I do have a question. I share the view that interdiction has failed, and I'd like to ask a follow-up question to the discussion on cigarette smoking. We're beginning to see a change in attitude on cigarette smoking and drinking and driving and casual multi-partner sex. And given that interdiction has failed, I'd like to ask why we aren't spending more federal dollars on research for education and treatment programs that work, and why we aren't then instituting those programs. At the federal level, my understanding is that we're spending a lot more on interdiction and criminal law enforcement than we are on treatment and education.
Commissioner Monroe?
Well, first of all, the notion that interdiction has failed is just wrong. The fact of the matter is that this country was virtually defenseless in 1980. You could walk across the border anywhere, you could fly across the border anywhere, you could do anything you wanted. We had no capability to defend ourselves. It's taken us. Sorry, you want an answer to this question, or do you want us to go on speaking?
More drugs are crossing the border this year than last year, even though the number of seizures have increased.
The problem you're talking about is the production abroad. Interdiction is about 10 times better than it was 8 years ago. Production abroad is 20 times worse. So we have a very serious problem with production abroad. That's one of the basic issues we have to face here, and I assume we'll get to that. We have countries there, for example, Colombia, that is virtually controlled now by the drug barons. So whether it's criminalized or not criminalized, we're going to have that problem in Colombia. So the big problem right now is international production.
Let me just make one point, if I may, before it gets lost. We are almost out of time on this segment. I would like to tell our audience that we will be, first of all, the radio audience will continue on. Judd Rose will be carrying on for the next half hour while we take a break for your local news. Then we will be coming back with a special edition of Nightline, and we will talk into the night on this subject. This panel will grow to the size of 12, and we will have a lot more on all that we are discussing right now. I just wanted to get that in before we lose it. Jesse Jackson.
I think it's fair to say that this administration's war on drugs, which has been led by Say No, has essentially failed. The Drug Enforcement Agency has 2,800 agents around the world, 1,700 Capitol Police in Washington guarding the Congress, and 28,000 police in New York. The fact is that as the interdiction was increasing, there was an attempt to cut back on the Coast Guard by $100 million and put those ships in mothballs. I submit this: we must look at the politics of this drug flow. We're consuming about $150 billion a year in drugs. It's not just those children on the streets and ball players. Bankers are laundering that money. Many government officials are turning their heads. There is, in fact, an inadequate commitment to convene those heads of state in Latin America, help deal with them for alternative economic development, because for many of them, it is their base economics now. It involves several dimensions.
Let me stop you. Unlike you and I have had the experience of being able to talk on as long as we wanted to on Nightline sometimes because I just extended. We're going to do that in a manner of speaking. This program, I'm afraid, because it's prime time, has to come to a hard end before 11 o'clock. So forgive me for interrupting you. We will be back with Jesse Jackson, with the rest of this panel, with an expanded panel, with your phone calls, with the live audience, with some more reports from ABC correspondents and our affiliates around the country. And all of that will be happening in just a half hour after your local news on an expanded edition of Nightline. And if you're listening to this program on radio, keep on listening. My friend and colleague Judd Rose will be joining you. I'm Ted Koppel in New York. I'll be back in half an hour.
The Koppel Report, a national town meeting, the legalization.
This is a special edition of Nightline. A national town meeting on the legalization of drugs.
Alcohol is an addictive drug. So is the nicotine in tobacco. Together, each year, they kill hundreds of thousands more Americans than all the illegal drugs combined. What would happen if we legalized marijuana, cocaine, even heroin? Some surprising answers from ABC News correspondents and affiliates around the country.
Heed the lessons of prohibition and treat drugs as a national health problem, not as a crime problem.
By legalizing drugs in our city or in Louisiana, period, I think it would destroy our society.
You can see what happened with drugs in the 19th century because we had a free economy in narcotics, a complete free enterprise.
Nice thing, though. Cocaine. What a wonderful drug. Anything that makes you paranoid and impotent, give me more of that.
You sell hash in different size bags.
Yes. Small bags, bigger bags. You want to see a few?
Yeah.
To legalize cocaine, in my opinion, would only worsen America.
It's not tough enough. I am not kidding you when I said that I feel we need a law to shoot them. And I'm sponsoring such a law, and I mean it.
Good evening. I'm Ted Koppel reporting tonight from New York, and we are continuing our national town meeting on the legalization of drugs. We are joined, as you can see, by a live audience. We'll be taking some of their questions and comments. Some of you will be able to interact with us also. Those of you watching this program on television will see a toll-free telephone number on your screen. I should point out that we're also being joined tonight by a national radio audience. For their benefit, let me read that telephone number now. It is 1-800-648-8094. 1-800-648-8094. I'll be repeating that number later in the broadcast. What our television audience is seeing now are the faces of and a list with the names of all the panelists and guests who will be joining us throughout the course of this evening. We wanted to be sure that no matter which aspect of the legalization subject comes up, we will have at least one guest who can address the issue. So much for introductions. Now, let's get underway. If you were with us during our prime time hour, you know that we just began to scratch the surface of whether drugs should be legalized in this country. One of the reasons that the issue is so rarely debated in public is that politicians have very little to gain and a great deal to lose by even acknowledging that the subject is worth debate. Almost all politicians do acknowledge that drug use is a massive problem and that current remedies aren't working. But to even suggest that legalization might be an answer is to run the risk that voters will see them as being in favor of drugs. We had to send correspondent James Walker all the way to Holland to find a country that is willing to try a somewhat different approach. The Dutch have not legalized drugs, but they've taken a couple of steps in that direction. Here's Walker's report.
This is the face of Amsterdam at night. Narrow streets jammed with people hungry for action. The atmosphere throbs with excitement and danger. When you go out on patrol, what are you looking for, in particular in this district?
Well, particularly for dealers.
Drug dealers?
Drug dealers, yeah. And in this area, you have soft drugs like hash and marijuana. Well, we don't work with that, especially hard drugs, cocaine and heroin we're searching for.
What do you mean you don't work with the soft drugs?
Well, when we caught someone with soft drugs, it's almost legalized here too. You can buy in many coffee shops here in the area, you can buy it free, hashish and marijuana.
Americans have an image of Holland as a paradise for drug users, but in fact there's a carefully thought out policy here, a policy designed to prevent people who smoke marijuana and hashish from turning to hard drugs, heroin and cocaine. What the Dutch government does is allow some coffee shops to sell small amounts of hashish and marijuana over the counter. The shops may not advertise, but everyone knows the soft drugs are available from a so-called house dealer. But that same house dealer is not allowed to sell heroin or cocaine. In other words, any hard drugs. That means coffee shop dealers have no financial incentive to get soft drug users to move on to hard drugs. Do you all smoke hash and marijuana?
Not regularly. We do smoke when, just
occasionally, just when it comes along.
One time, 2 times in a year.
Have you also tried cocaine?
No, never. We won't.
Why?
There's a bit of a difference between the two things. I mean, a hash, well, it's just, you smoke it and, well, that's it. No problem. But coke, well, it's expensive and it's heavy. You know, it's a hard drug. We have this difference between the two.
The difference is significant. Dutch officials draw the line with drug traffickers. Dealers of hard drugs face imprisonment. Drug-related crimes such as stealing to support a habit are prosecuted. But users of heroin or cocaine in Holland are not arrested by police. Instead, they're treated, for example, like alcoholics, as people with just another medical problem to be assisted. What do you do if you see somebody shooting up heroin?
I just tell him to get lost. But I don't take his injection needle.
And you don't arrest him?
No. if you arrest this guy, you keep him for a few hours and you put him on the street again, he has to commit a new crime to get money for his new heroin, because he needs his heroin every day.
Dutch officials believe their policy, tolerance of drug use, but tough laws against dealers, is working. Heroin use has declined. They also say they are in contact with 80% or 6,400 drug addicts who are in relatively good health. Their policy towards soft drugs, they feel, has been even more successful. The Katsu Coffee House has operated in this quiet, low-income neighborhood without interference from the police. The menu includes coffee, tea, hot chocolate, and soft drugs.
You sell hash in different size bags?
Yes. Small bags, bigger bags. You want to see a few?
Yeah. So this is what?
Afghanistan.
This is hashish from Afghanistan.
Yes.
Peter sells 25 different kinds of marijuana and hashish in $6 and $12 bags. He won't say how he gets it, just that his supply is bigger than ever, and so is his business. This woman brought an 8-year-old child with her. She ordered orange juice for the girl, hashish for herself.
I buy my weekly amount of hashish over here, and I do so for 20 years. And my brain is still functioning, and I work for the government in Holland.
Is it wise, do you think, to bring a youngster into a place like this?
Her father smokes, I smoke, she sees it all around. And when you keep it away from a child, then they tend to get curious about what's going on. I wouldn't think of bringing her to another place like this. I mean, no other hash place. This is the best place in Amsterdam. Decent people, decent management, decent prices, decent quality.
Dutch officials believe that talking and acting openly about drugs has reduced their attraction, their mystique. That, they say, has contributed to the decline in marijuana and hashish. And their studies show that while there is a slight increase in cocaine use, fewer young people are trying heroin. So the Dutch experiment appears to be working, proving that at least in this country, it is possible to fight drugs without declaring war. James Walker, ABC News, Amsterdam.
As you can see behind me, our panel has thrived and multiplied. Joining us now, several new guests, among them the Mayor of New York City, the Honorable Mayor Koch. What do you think about all of this?
Well, that's a very slanted program, because I just...
I'm not talking about the program. Yeah. I'm talking about that spot you just saw in Holland.
That's what I mean.
Oh, okay.
That film was a very slanted film. I was in Amsterdam not very long ago, and it is true that they have a policy of allowing marijuana to be sold openly in these cafes. And I objected to it in a little debate that we had. Not that we don't sell marijuana, obviously, in the city of New York, even though it's against the law. But I said that if you allow it, as you're doing, you're encouraging people to go on to harder drugs. That's my own position in this matter. And the mayor of Amsterdam is a very good man. He said, until we're able to eliminate the harder drugs, we're going to allow the marijuana. And then when we get the harder drugs eliminated, then we'll go to the marijuana. I don't think that's ever going to happen. Now, when you talk about legalization, it's as though you reinvented the wheel. In Great Britain, they had legalization in 1965, and they eliminated it in 1985 because the drug population quadrupled. And what are we going to do? Are we going to give a heroin, if that's the drug of choice? You'll be spreading AIDS. Are we going to be giving crack through some government store? You will be creating violent behavior, because that's what crack does. So what I'm simply saying is that the idea that Bill Buckley had, who I like, but on this one he's wrong, that you should allow adults to have it, but children you would execute the dispenser. You and I know that's ridiculous, because some of the dispensers will be children. Today they announced in Nassau County that an 11-year-old was picked up selling crack. Are we going to execute that kid? We're not going to execute that kid.
Tell you what, you were saying that you were in a debate with the mayor of Amsterdam.
Yes.
I can't provide you with the mayor, but I can provide you with a gentleman from Holland, Mr. Van Vliet, who founded a private drug research institute in Amsterdam. You heard what Mayor Koch had to say. He just doesn't think it's a terribly effective program. Has it been effective, do you think, in terms of limiting, in other words, those who are allowed now to smoke hashish, marijuana, without any particular interference? Have you not found that they have moved on to harder drugs?
Hardly anybody.
But I wanted to ask a question to Major Koch. How long has he been in Amsterdam?
How long was I there? Oh, I was there a week, but I was in, or maybe even less than a week, but every day with the mayor taking me around 12 hours a day. And what we saw in that scene there, that's the prostitution area of Amsterdam.
But I asked you this question because in this week that you were there, you could have seen all the addicts that we have in the Netherlands. There are so few compared...
12,000, isn't it? 12,000?
In all of the Netherlands, about 15 to 20,000.
Okay.
Out of a population of how many?
Out of a population of almost 15 million. And that's quite a lot less than here in the United States. And I think that especially quite a lot less than in Major Koch City.
Sure.
But I think that on the whole we have managed to create a set of minor drug problems compared to this inextricable problem that you have, I think, created here in the United States.
The key, it seems to me, I mean, first of all...
may I finish my sentence? Because
Sure.
I wanted to make the point that this drug policy that we have developed during the last 20 years in the Netherlands has created a low level of not only marijuana use because of a formal decriminalization, but also a very, very low level of cocaine use, and also a decreasing level of heroin use, and especially shooting of heroin because of, for instance, the supply of needles. What I want to say is that a policy that leads to an availability of drugs or paraphernalia will not always increase drug use, but can help to manage, to contain the problems for the addicts, for the society, and for the immediate circles in which the addicts has to live.
Let me ask one of our callers, and then Mayor Koch will come right back to you. Let me ask one of our callers, and I should point out, incidentally, I'd like to apologize to many of you who've been trying with great frustration to call in. Phone companies had some problems. One of the only states in the country which has been able to get through is Iowa. Here's a caller now from Cedar Rapids. Can you hear me, caller?
Yes, Ted, I can.
Go ahead.
I'd like to start by saying 15 minutes into your program, I turned it off and headed for my phone. I'm sick of hearing this rhetoric over and over again. I'm a recovering addict. I tuned in, turned on, and dropped out in the 60s for about 20 years. On drug usage, there is no moderation. There's one ultimate goal, to get high or to get loaded. And the whole policy of thinking about legalization is stupidity and sheer ignorance. Take tobacco, for one thing. Okay, Iowa has the highest tax in the nation on cigarettes. I'm paying about 2 cents a cigarette to kill myself. They make that illegal. I'll quit smoking tomorrow. They make it illegal. It's just... it's a dead-end street.
Okay.
Okay,
Is there a question you wanted to ask, or someone on the panel that you wanted to...
I'm fed up with all this rhetoric about legal... It's just... Okay, there's a certain percentage of people alive today that are going to continue to take drugs until they're dead. Do you legalize it, you're going to make it open doors for people who will never have access to it unless it was legal.
I'll tell you what, we have one of the more eloquent defenders of this policy, Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz, a law professor. Alan, I know you've been just chafing for the past hour and a half to get in on this discussion. Go for it. You heard what the man had to say. Crazy policy. He's sick and tired.
I think nobody here has been speaking out on behalf of the victims of drugs. The victims are the average, ordinary people who don't use drugs. And the heroin addict is gonna get his drugs by hook or by crook or by gun or by knife. And the question that Mayor Koch has to answer is whether or not he wants that heroin addict to get it by robbing my mother and your sister and other helpless victims, or whether he is going to make available to the mainline heroin addict a medical alternative, an option. And if he won't do that, all the rhetoric about victims' rights, you can throw out the window. It's a lot of political crap.
Okay, let me respond to that. I like Alan, and he runs a wonderful delicatessen up in Cambridge.
Speaking about addictive drugs, right?
What I think you have to understand is that if we were in the business of dispensing, so what happens? Somebody walks in and says, I want crack. You give them crack.
Let's talk about heroin. Let's talk about mainline heroin.
Well, you're just saying heroin. I'm saying I'll take heroin too in this context. Someone says, I want heroin, and you know that a certain percentage of them, because it's the nature of the use of heroin, are going to go out and use common needles, and a certain percentage of them are going to get AIDS.
No, you're the one who's making them use the common needles.
No.
I would have Dr. Tim give him the medical needle.
I am just telling you. I said it's part of the drug syndrome. It is.
That's bigotry.
Well,
that's bigotry.
Oh, come on,
no,
Alan.
Heroin addicts would prefer to use a clean needle than a dirty needle.
Some. Now, I want to go a little bit further.
Give them the choice.
When you have drugs available, legal drugs, don't you think that there will be designer drugs coming out? And that the designer drugs, the government's not good at designing anything. So this will be the private sector that will be designing those drugs. And don't you think those addicts will be going to the designer drugs? And the same guy who is pillaging and raping and shooting and everything else that you suggested, and it is a fact that they're doing it, will do it to get the money for the extra drugs. And in most places, like Great Britain, when they had maintenance, legal maintenance, you couldn't get all the drugs that you wanted. You got enough to maintain you, and then you went to the black market and you got more because your habit keeps getting greater. So I'm saying it's ridiculous.
Gentlemen, this is an enchanting conversation, You both have a galvanizing way of focusing the discussion. Let me, however, turn to some of our other guests here. Dr. Mitch Rosenthal is a psychiatrist. He's president of the Phoenix House Foundation, the nation's largest multi-service program for prevention and treatment of drug abuse. You were nodding your head in assent to what Mayor Koch was saying a moment ago.
Well, Mayor Koch put his finger on something that the English found out in the late 60s and early 70s with the distribution of heroin, which was when addicts got available government heroin, many of them continued to do what they did before they got it, which was if they picked pockets, they continued to pick pockets. If they robbed cars, they continued to rob cars. That is, giving them an available drug did not make them into law-abiding citizens that we'd like to have as neighbors.
What about the Dutch example? We sort of buried that rather quickly. Is it just that there is something about the Dutch mentality that allows that sort of thing to work in Holland and not work in New York City?
Well, it hasn't been my experience with the Netherlands. We helped, Phoenix House helped the Dutch to set up therapeutic communities back in the late 60s and early 70s. And we have seen a continued problem of heroin and serious drug use in that country. I think the fact that they are able to tolerate as much dysfunction as they do says a lot for them. I think it is a difficult way to look at the problem. I wonder what parent watching this program tonight would think if he or she had an addicted son or daughter, that the answer was to give that child more drugs and to make it easier for them as a parent to become an enabler or for our culture to become an enabler.
Hold on just a second. I mean, neither side in this argument has apparently any limit on the kind of emotional appeal. I mean, Al Dershowitz was worrying about my mother and your sister, and but should we really be talking about the
well,
kid? I think no one is arguing about giving kids drugs.
I have great respect for Alan, but I think he is missing a point, which is a lot of people who use heroin are very, very disturbed people before they ever begin to use heroin. Our prisons have 60% of their populations with people who have drug problems who are not there because of drug-related crimes, but who are very disturbed, antisocial, dysfunctional people who also take drugs. And these people are not going to be made well if we give them drugs.
But if we give them drugs and get them into your program and use the giving them of drugs as a hook, to use a bad phrase, to get them into medical treatment, which, by the way, isn't available today to all addicts, then we at least begin to have a grasp on the problem.
And, I tell you, if you'll forgive me, we have to go to a break. The great frustration here is just when we get a conversation rolling, we have to break away for a commercial, but that's the way it is on commercial television. We'll be right back.
I was always the person that I figured that I could never be a drug addict, and I could never live on the streets, and I could never sell my soul or anything else for drugs. But I did. I was formerly a stockbroker, and I lost everything. I was at the top of the heap, and I took a sharp, short decline down to the bottom. I hit rock bottom.
The cost to American society of drug abuse in terms of lost productivity is estimated at more than $30 billion a year. More than $20 billion is lost to drug-related crime.
The legalization
stimulates, then depresses the brain. Pulse slows, blood pressure drops, muscles relax. Heroin does not produce hallucinations or mind-altering sensations. The initial high or rush is described as a surge of pleasure followed by dreamy relaxation lasting 2 to 6 hours. Heroin is a physically addictive drug. The body begins to tolerate heroin, and progressively larger doses are required to produce a high. For addicts, withdrawal symptoms begin about 8 hours after the last fix. They include vomiting, diarrhea, and chills. Withdrawal causes extreme discomfort, but it is not usually life-threatening. Heart and vein inflammation, infectious diseases, and the transmission of the AIDS virus through shared needles are health hazards commonly associated with heroin addiction. Overdoses, which occur more frequently with occasional users than with addicts, can be fatal.
ABC News commissioned a poll on the subject of drugs, drug addiction, and related areas. We're going to be going to that poll throughout the course of the evening. Take a look here at one of the first questions that was asked. Which is a bigger problem in your community? Take a look there, because you've got 886, in other words, 2 years ago, and then you will see 988 this month. And you will see that 2 years ago, 44% in this country believed that alcohol was the biggest problem in their community. 39% drugs, 12% equal, 2% neither. By September of this year, alcohol had diminished to 38%. Drugs had increased to 45%. Those who thought they were equal problems, still 12%, neither 3%. There is more to come. Alcohol or drugs? Has either ever been a cause of trouble in your family? Here's the response. 29% said alcohol, 14% said drugs. Dr. Tim Johnson, one thing about those questions and those answers strikes me as curious. On the one hand, we have people saying that they think the bigger problem is, in other words, in September of this year, they say the bigger problem in their perception is drugs. Drugs, bigger problem than alcohol. And yet when the question is put in a personal sense, have you ever had trouble with it in your own family? Then clearly alcohol is a much bigger problem than drugs. Why that warped perception, or what seems like a warped perception?
I'm not sure it is a warped perception. I think it accurately reflects what goes on number-wise in our society. Alcohol is, in fact, a bigger problem in terms of deaths, in terms of morbidity short of death. And I think it points to what is an ultimate issue for me in this whole drug issue. The only way that we're ever going to eliminate the drug problem, in fact, of course, is to eliminate demand. And the only way we're going to eliminate demand is to have a very vast and pervasive societal change of attitude. And I don't see that ever happening until we deal as a society with the tobacco and alcohol issue in terms of dealing with our young people. So that if I were going to sit here and start to solve the drug problem for the next 50 years, I think I would start by thinking of economic alternatives to the tobacco and alcohol industries in this country that could take place over the next 50 years, leading to elimination of that problem, and then we could be able to deal honestly with the entire societal attitude toward drugs. Until we deal with tobacco and alcohol, I'm convinced we can't honestly deal with drugs.
Ken, I'm very concerned.
Please, Mr. Von Raab, and let me just point out to those members of our audience who are just joining us, William Von Raab is the Director of Customs for the United States. Go ahead, Mr. Von Raab.
Quickly, with respect to the Netherlands, their plant is a disaster. Their property crime is the highest ever. Insurance rates are going out of sight. And the rest of the European community is scared to death of 1992 for fear what will happen when they get involved with them. But more importantly, we talked earlier about mixed signals. If you would permit me, I'd like to give some clear signals to your listeners from your government. And that is, drugs are dangerous. Legalizing drugs will do nothing but bring more users and more addicts, probably 4 to 5 times more than we have now. Legalizing drugs will not cut down on the crime associated with that. This is not the time to vacillate. This is not the time to cut and run. This is the time to maintain our strong attitudes in opposition to drugs and not give up.
Hey, can I respond to that?
All right, just 1 second. First Jesse Jackson, and then go ahead.
It seems to me that to legalize drugs is in effect to make a moral and ethical and a medical judgment. It's basically all right. The government makes that judgment. It must accept the responsibility for controlling those drugs and collecting taxes and licensing those drugs, which in effect is open season with the same kind of access to coke, crack, and heroin that you and I have to lick and cigarettes. Of course, we're now trying to stop the lick and cigarette flow because it's killing people. These drugs, of course, kill even more. My fear is that...
Which drugs kill even more?
That cocaine,
no, they don't.
Crack.
No, they don't.
No, that's because at this point, you do not have the same access to them.
Well, so you are speculating, you are projecting that if they were legalized, they would kill more, but you can't say they do.
It's an intelligent projection because I live out there with the people. And I can give you, I was in Watts.
Mr. Jackson, you may live with the people. You may live with the people, but let me at least point out what the current reality is, even among those people. Last year, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people died as a direct consequence of all the illicit drugs rolled up together. By contrast, roughly 450,000 people died as a consequence of using alcohol and cigarettes, so it's not even close.
Let's go a step further. I was in Watts where you have these killings going on now. A few weeks ago.
The killings? You're talking about like drug killings?
Absolutely.
Gang killings?
Precisely. The easy access to guns.
You're raising a wonderful question.
I certainly am. And the easy access, I certainly am. The easy access to drugs and guns, the sickness and greed thereof, create in effect a war zone, and we're looking at it on TV as Night in the Drama. I submit to you that the impact of the cocaine, crack, and heroin drive is so dangerous and so poison, we should take a broader look and fight to cut the supply of it and the demand for it. My experience is that the number one threat to us on America's streets today is not communism or an alien ideology. It is the flow of coke, crack, and drugs, and yet we take communism far more seriously than we do drug laws and their impact.
Well, actually, we don't. You'll be interested to know, and I don't know if we can get the stack up there, but I'll do it from memory. That poll that we took a year ago, you would have been right. A year ago, when the poll was taken, we found that roughly 26 or 27% of the American public saw foreign policy as being the biggest problem in the United States. This year, that's down to 7%, and the drug problem, which a year ago was regarded by only 7% of the population as being, and there's the, here come the figures. Hold on just a second, where are they? There they are. See, in 1987, 6% saw drugs as the most important problem facing the United States. International affairs, 26%. Take a look at what's happened this year. September, 20% of the American public sees drugs as being the biggest problem, the most important problem facing the USA. International affairs, poverty, budget deficit, unemployment, all down at 7%.
I'm aware of the poll because I have to change the data by putting it in the center of the national political debate this year. And what it is, Dukakis or George Bush or Mrs. Reagan and Mr. Reagan, it is now a central issue. And when we are caught with Noriega on our payroll as a foreign policy matter, funding the conscious with drugs, the foreign policy matter, the politics of drugs cannot be left out and just focus on the streets of New York. We're buying $150 billion worth of drugs a year. Don't remove bankers and politicians from some ultimate solution of cutting supply and cutting demand.
Ted, can I just get in on this?
Let me just
for 1
identify
minute?
you for our radio audience who can't see you. Ethan Nadelman is an associate professor at Princeton University and has written some seminal articles on the subject of legalizing drugs. Go ahead.
You know, we look at those polls and you see 20% of Americans concerned about this issue. I think the real reason is that over the last 7 to 8 years, the Reagan administration and the Democratic leadership in this country have competed with one another in concocting the most disastrous drug policy since national prohibition. I mean, what's really gone out the window here is any form of logical analysis. You have to know that something's wrong when Ronald Reagan, his Commissioner of Customs, Ed Koch, Jesse Jackson all agree on something that is so clearly a failure. Now, I'll tell you what legalization is. People are talking about legalization now, and it really boils down to two things. Legalization is, first of all, it's a mode of analysis. It's a way of looking at the problem. It's probably responsible in part for the fact that politicians are now talking about using more in terms of drug treatment education and less in terms of drug enforcement. That drug enforcement has hit a point of declining returns. In fact, it hit that point a long time ago. The second thing is this. The second thing is this, is that in many ways it's become a certain word to symbolize what repeal stood for at the end of Prohibition. I mean, legalization does not mean some libertarian scenario of free drugs available to everybody. What it means is looking for alternatives to the current policies. That's what's important. At the end of Prohibition, people debated, what should we have? Local control, state control, national control? Should we legalize just beer or wine or hard liquor? Should we look at the Swedish model, the British model, the Canadian model? They debated those things rationally. That is not happening today. That's what really needs to happen. I mean, people have to realize that today's drug laws are simply, the vast majority of Americans get nothing out of today's drug laws for the simple reason that the vast majority of Americans are not going to become drug addicts even if drugs are legal.
Professor Nadelman, you've raised an interesting problem. Dr. Thornton, if you'll hold on, please, and Mayor Koch and Dr. Rosenthal, what we're going to do is take a break. When we come back, we are going to take a look at an issue that was just raised, namely the example of prohibition, which is frequently referred to, usually by people who have not gone back and examined just what it was prohibition did or did not succeed in doing. We'll be back with that in a moment.
Substances derived from coca leaves were introduced to Europe in the middle of the 19th century. In 1884, cocaine was made commercially available. Fans of cocoa wine included Thomas Edison, William McKinley, Sarah Bernhardt, 3 popes, and 16 kings and queens. Coca-Cola, originally promoted as a brain tonic, contained the equivalent of 2 lines of cocaine per serving until 1903, when the cocaine was replaced by caffeine.
Depressant, alcohol slows the brain's ability to process and transmit information. Vision, coordination, speech, emotion, and thinking are all impaired. Eventually, the drunk falls asleep or, in extreme cases, lapses into a coma. Heavy drinking damages nearly every organ in the body, taking its worst toll on the liver and the brain. It is estimated that 100,000 Americans die each year of alcohol-related problems, including drunk driving fatalities. Alcohol can cause physical dependency, and addicts suffer from the withdrawal syndrome known as the DTs. Symptoms include hallucinations, convulsions, and disorientation. And approximately 20% of those who go into the DTs will die if untreated. Current research suggests that some people are biologically more vulnerable to alcohol abuse than are others.
There is only one time in this nation's history that we treated consumption and sale of alcohol as a crime, as we now do with the illicit drugs that have been mentioned throughout the course of this program. That was during Prohibition, of course, an experiment widely regarded today as a failure. But was it? We asked Jay Shadler to look into that question, and here is his report.
What was illegal, in fact, what was unconstitutional, was alcohol, whiskey. The 18th Amendment, prohibited. So, of course, all we did in school was drink a lot of whiskey.
Vermont Royster was in college when prohibition was the law of the land, and ignoring it seemed to become a national pastime.
It was pretty rot gut stuff, but we drank a lot of it.
I get no kick from champagne.
Of course, banning booze in 1920 was begun with the best of intentions, but Prohibition was tested in perhaps the century's most raucous laboratory, the Roaring Twenties, a juicy, jazzy decade of high rollers and slow foxtrots. Indeed, if you wanted to break the law, Prohibition made it speakeasy. But do all these fading photographs and memories paint a true portrait of Prohibition? The answer is no. Gangsters in old places like this, which used to be a speakeasy, may have grabbed the headlines, but most Americans were obeying the law. They were not drinking. In fact, between 1900 and 1910, before Prohibition, the average American drank over 2 gallons of alcohol a year. But by the end of the noble experiment, consumption had been cut by more than half. Today, 55 years after the end of Prohibition, consumption has more than doubled to 2.6 gallons per capita. And cirrhosis of the liver, a well-known alcohol-related illness, dropped dramatically from 13.8 deaths per 100,000 before Prohibition to 7.7 deaths by the end of Prohibition. Today, with consumption back up again, death by cirrhosis is also back up to 11.2 per 100,000. And according to one study, even the rate of Americans admitted to mental hospitals for the treatment of what was called alcoholic psychosis dropped from over 10% to less than 5% during Prohibition. But although the public was healthier, it wasn't necessarily happier with Prohibition. Nationwide, 1,500 federal agents battled a battalion of bootleggers, perhaps as many as 10,000 in New York City alone. And that opened the door to organized crime.
They could and did, or they could afford to bribe the police, just as the crack, cocaine, narcotics dealers today can afford to bribe the police. You made big business out of it.
In the end, the Depression sounded the death knell for Prohibition. Couple the promise of big tax revenues and jobs if booze was legalized again to the fact that alcohol, unlike cocaine and other narcotics, had long played a social role for many Americans, and you had a nation ready for a drink when FDR signed the 21st Amendment in 1933.
It means revenue for the federal, state, and local treasuries. It means respect for law and decrease for crime.
Of course, organized crime was not defeated, but most of the country was focusing on the fact that alcohol was legal again. Over the next 5 years, consumption per capita increased 50%, proof that some Americans had been deterred by Prohibition.
As a public health measure, Prohibition was really a success. It was as a social measure, as a cultural measure, that it was unsuccessful and could not be sustained. But Prohibition, as an outside case, shows that laws have effects.
I get no kick.
Still, it is the romantic image of the Jazz Age that frames our recollection of Prohibition. The fact that the majority of Americans obeyed the law against alcohol has been lost over the years in the mist of memories, of irreverence, celebration, and plenty of illegal booze for anyone who wanted it. This is Jay Shadler reporting from Boston.
I'd like to remind our listeners and our viewers that you can call in directly to this program if you call 1-800-648-8094. We have a question on microphone A over there. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, good night, Ted. My question is this. I myself have used drugs in excess of over 24 years. I think there isn't a drug that grows or that man's developed that I haven't tried. I've been totally drug-free and alcohol-free for the past 2 years. And first, it behooves me that they separate alcohol and drugs as if they were two different categories, because anything that's addicting to me is a drug. Okay, that's one. Second of all, I can't understand, you see, how all this talk on legalization, I know we have a serious problem, and I know that there's no quick solution to it. And I'm not even too sure about whether legalization is the only way that we can tackle this problem at this point. But I do know that there's no habit. I mean, in all my years of drug abuse, I never woke up the next morning wanting $20 of heroin when the day before I had $100 worth. Habits to me increase daily. You see,
All right. You're making some interesting points, but I'm not exactly sure I know where you're leading, and if you could have it all somehow end up in a question, that'd be terrific.
Okay, well, the question is that, you know, where do you draw the line? I mean, you're going to have someone that walks in with a $30 a day habit. He gets on this, what is it, a clinic? And and his habit increases daily because, I mean, the tolerance level, increases.
So
he's going to need more of the drug. And what does this legalization mean? That we keep feeding and feeding and feeding until this guy dies?
Let me pose the question to Dr. Shirley Thornton. She is the Deputy Superintendent of Instruction for the state of California, member of the Mayor of San Francisco's Task Force on Drugs. Dr. Thornton, the suggestion there is that there's no way you can treat any kind of drug abuse by giving drugs to the abusers.
I totally concur. It was Mayor Dianne Feinstein at the time when we had the Drug Task Force Committee in San Francisco. I think there are a number of things, and I know I better grab it now because once we lose the mic, we seem to lose it for a while. First of all, the whole issue on legalization, I think, is a catwalk. We've realized now through enforcement we can't handle the issue. We have yet, in all of this prestigiousness of panel, talk about community, talk about the misalignment of culture, talk about why we have gotten to the state we have. And we keep trying to find answers outside of the community. I've not heard us talk to community folk about how do we come in and assist you in correcting the problem, not how do we come in and make it right for you. Because obviously we, the institutions, have not been able to do that.
When you
I don't
talk
think
about the
we can
catwalk,
ever.
I'm sorry,
yes.
you use that phrase, legalization as a catwalk.
I think because instead of us dealing with the problems we have within our communities, the problems we have within our schools, that we are not holding the institutions and the service providers accountable for the fact that they have failed, but we still put more and more dollars to the problems without involvement of community, we will be talking about this 50 years from the day until we really become people to assist communities, not tell them what they need. We have tried through law enforcement to solve problems that we created, not the community. We have people now in the communities telling us how they can solve their problems. We have schools saying we want our children educated. We want teachers and everyone held accountable for what's happening. We want probation officers to work with us and not have caseloads that are so large that they can't work. When our youngsters come out of CYA, you said earlier that we're not talking about children. Well, the average age 13, we have to begin dealing with drugs. And as mentioned here, 8- and 9-year-olds. So I don't know how we can talk about legalization and pretend we're talking about adults of free will. We're talking about a society that once we talk about what is legal and what is illegal, we begin to continue to destroy our children. Along with that, people who played with drugs, middle-class America, the yuppie, chuppie, buppy huppies, had someplace else to go. In the 60s, people experimented, but they said, well, I'm tired of this, let me go back to law school. I'm tired of this, let me go back and maybe someday run for president or something. Others did not have that choice. So we have poor people who, when it's all over, have no place to go to but the continuance of the streets. They have no option but to stay with drugs. The legal issue is, to me, not the real issue. It's how do we give viable alternatives to poor people and inner city folk to take control of their own lives.
Okay. You have spoken eloquently, Dr. Thornton. You've also made the point that, once you grab the mic, you've got to hold on to it. I should point out, at this point, I think we have 1, 2, 3, at least 4 people on this panel who have not yet had a chance to talk at all. And when we come back, we will do that. And we will also visit with Mayor Schmoke in Baltimore. But we have to take a break once again. We'll be back in a moment.
A recent study by the National Law Journal of 181 top state and local prosecutors found that 25% felt that marijuana should be decriminalized. 73% rejected zero tolerance as an important enforcement policy. Some 60% of the prosecutors say they felt their efforts are having little to no impact in reducing the supply of illegal drugs, increasing their cost, or limiting their use.
Finally, Equal Treatment
and Cruise Line invite you to join them for 7 days of absolute perfection.
RSVP your local travel agent. And don't just cruise the Caribbean. Cruise the Royal Caribbean.
Okay, let's eat.
Daddy, you forgot the...
On good, it's pleasure, relaxation, heightened sensory awareness, and feelings of being suspended in time. Highs may also include irritability, paranoia, and food cravings. In common dosages, pot may impair short-term memory, alter time perception, and reduce coordination. The drug causes the heart to beat faster by as much as 50%. Marijuana smoke contains more cancer-causing agents than tobacco, and chronic use impairs lung function. Marijuana may also damage the immune system, inhibit fertility, and cause premature birth. The body does not become physically addicted to marijuana, but it can cause psychological dependency.
And we are back live once again. And go ahead, sir. You have a question or a comment that you'd like to address to Congressman Rangel?
Yes, as a libertarian, I'm very concerned about the threat to our civil liberties posed by the drug laws. For example, there are tens of millions of people who occasionally use marijuana who are responsible members of their community. And there are currently legislation in Congress and in state legislatures that would take away a person's home, their kids, their car, evict them from their apartments, revoke professional licenses, revoke student aid, public housing. And all of this can be done if they just catch the person with a single marijuana joint. Now, what I'm concerned about is that this drug war is turning into a witch hunt. If there are going to be laws against marijuana, I'd like to know, where would you put the people who are occasional users of marijuana, who are responsible people? I mean, what kind, should they have these things hang over their head?
I think, sir, we have the thrust of your question.
And for Jesse Jackson as well, too. I want him to answer it.
Yeah, let me just point out that Congressman Rangel, in, what is it, another 4 or 5 days, your subcommittee is going to start hearings?
No, it'll be a week and a half.
Another week and a half, all right. So we'll be continuing this conversation in the sacred, hallowed halls of Congress.
It'll be more than a conversation when I chair the hearings. I'd like to say that...
It'll be an inquisition.
That you're just a little too sensitive, Professor.
No.
I think that the Congress has over-responded during the political year, and I think that in many cases the attack has been a war against the Constitution rather than a so-called war against drugs. But the reason for that, and what bothers me and what frustrates me, is that when responsible people say we should discuss the question of legalization, and they don't feel any obligation to talk about any of the problems that comes with legalization. I think that it's great to get on a talk show, to write a book, and to say that we should not be blinded by an approach that hasn't worked. But I think that especially public officials have a responsibility to find out why hasn't it worked. And I've been asking the questions, this war against drugs, who has been the leader in this war against drugs? Who are the generals in the war against drugs? You mentioned that the American people are outraged because now they think that drugs is more important than foreign policy. Very interesting, because the person that has the responsibility in directing our foreign policy has never had drugs on his agenda. Secretary of State Schultz. You can talk about arms control, communism, terrorism, the Middle East, but never has he talked about drugs. If you really want to talk about it as a health problem, why haven't some of the professors or the advocates of legalization said, why hasn't the Secretary of Health and Human Services at least have that on the agenda in the so-called war? We don't have one federal rehabilitation program in the United States or anywhere.
Congressman, let me interrupt you for a moment only to urge you to go on. What I'd like to hear you tell me, you were saying you don't think that the right questions have been asked about legalization and what the consequences would be.
Exactly.
Ask 2 or 3 of them.
Okay, I would like to know which drugs are going to be legalized, which communities are they going to be dispensed? Is it going to be a private sector initiative? Is it only going to be for the wealthy that can afford to go to a doctor? Will we expand Medicaid for the poor, Medicare for the aged? The person asks a question over there, how much do we give? if you're really into drugs, not because you just like to be around the people, but because you want to get high, who determines when you're high? And do you go into the question of overdose? And if you don't get involved in that question, then where do you go for the rest of it? You know?
You've got some absolutely terrific questions. Let me go first of all to Mayor Schmoke, who's still standing by in Baltimore. Mayor Schmoke, as you told us earlier, you were a prosecutor before you went honest and became a politician. And I'd like to ask you the last question that Congressman Rangel posed, which is, where do you draw the line? Someone has a $40 a day habit. Do you supply them with $40 a day worth of drugs, or $100 or $200 a day?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, I intend to address a lot of those questions at the hearings on September 29th that the Congressman has been so kind to schedule before his House Select Committee. But I would start, first of all, with a national commission that would look at all these drugs and decide, based on relative harm to an individual, how we would regulate it. And that would mean, for example, that cigarettes might indeed be regulated differently than they are today, because we consider the harm greater than, let's say, marijuana to the body. But I think that there are a number of ways in which we can regulate it through health professionals, doctors, clinics, and yes, indeed, provide certain addicting substances to addicts as we begin a maintenance program, which hopefully will get them off.
At what kind of a maintenance level? I mean, you missed the tough part of the question, which is, let's say someone walks in with a $200 a day habit, Mayor.
Correct. And the doctor, and he says, I'm an addict. I come to you, doctor, to help me control this habit.
No, he comes
with
to
the
get
idea
high,
of ultimately
Mayor. That's why
getting
he's
off.
there.
No, the idea is, wouldn't you rather have that addict go to his physician, even if he's using his Medicaid card, get the cocaine from that physician, and not sneak around in an alley, break into a
physicians. I don't know what happens in Baltimore, but most junkies don't have their local doctor.
That's what we're trying to get them. We're trying to get them doctors so that it can be treated as a medical problem. And a $200 a day heroin addict costs about $10 when you take it off the black market and let a doctor administer it on a medical basis. Doctors don't give overdoses any more than they give overdoses for back pains today.
If you
give medically administered appropriate doses.
If you want to expand the Medicaid program,
I do,
so that we can now legalize drugs, where has been your voice in expanding the Medicaid program to take care of non-addicts? In other words, we haven't even heard one thing. We don't have one federal rehabilitation center throughout the United States.
Absolutely.
So what you're saying is, and there's another point, Ted, that I think everyone should have to admit when you talk about legalization, is that you are going to expand the number of addicts. I don't think there's any question about it. Even Mayor Schmoke says that the turnoff is that there'll be less violence in the street.
That's right.
Let me introduce.
Ted, we've got to address that issue. It's important. We have been talking generally throughout this discussion tonight about the issue of addiction and whether it would be more or less. The drug problem in our country is really twofold. It's, yes, the issue of addiction, but also the crime associated with the trafficking in the drugs. And it's the crime that has changed the character of America's cities. When Reverend Jackson was talking about those gangs out in the street, he talked about the fact that guns were available and the fact that drugs were available. But that's not why these young people are shooting each other. They're shooting each other because of the profit to be made in drugs. It's this enormous price. It's all the money to be made. And unless we decriminalize, money and profit is still going to be made in there, and we're going to keep throwing more and more and more of these people in prison, and there's going to be more killing.
Hold on one second. Congressman, if you'd hold on 1 second. Robert Stutman is Special Agent in charge of New York for the Drug Enforcement Administration. This is your bag. No pun intended. Oh, God, you have to be so careful with the words you use on this show, don't you? I heard earlier today that it costs $70,000 to prosecute in Miami, that it costs $70,000 to prosecute someone who is dealing in crack, and that it may take up to a year, tie up the legal system for up to a year. Give us a sense of what the costs are here and what your views are when we talk about decriminalizing for the purpose of sort of bringing things into balance.
I think the bottom line issue is, as the chairman said, he's exactly right. I don't think anyone on this panel would argue if we legalize, more people will use. Now, what does that mean? According to last year's New York City figures, 73% of the kids in this city who died as a result of child abuse or battering, there was drug abuse tied to that. That means that type of thing will go up. We certainly know, of course, that when we did away with prohibition, we certainly did away with organized crime. Obviously, we didn't. Organized crime simply shifted to another type of crime. And unless we are prepared to make all drugs legal for all people at all ages, then the people who are presently selling drugs to the general population will simply shift their gears and aim their gears towards that group that is exculped from getting the legal drugs, and the black market will continue to be the same, but aimed at young kids and drugs like crack. The other issue we know is that most regular drug users, and the issue is not just heroin in deference to Mr. Dershowitz. In fact, the heroin problem is, in fact, leveling off and in some cases decreasing. The issue is drugs like cocaine and crack, specifically in New York City, that causes most crime. In the areas of New York City that have the cheapest and most available crack at $3 to $5 a vial, the crime level is the highest, which goes in direct contradiction with what Mr. Dershowitz said. And finally, of course, we know that most drug users will continue to be involved with crime even if we give them drugs. I trust none of us are so naive to believe that if we give a guy who is used to, for 2 to 3 years, banging somebody over the head for $200 a day for drugs, if we give him his drugs, he's then going to go to work for $150 a week. We're not that naive, are we? And finally, I will tell you, I have been in this business for 23 years, and the only addiction I have seen, the addiction that's stronger than the addiction to crack, is the addiction to quick and easy money, and that will continue by drug users, even if you give them drugs. What we must do is do away with the demand and do away with the supply.
You and Congressman Rangel have raised some extraordinarily interesting questions. We have yet to hear from Hugh Downs. We have yet to hear from Dr. Jerome Jaffe, and we're going to do that and a couple of other things when we come back in just a moment.
On a DEA undercover videotape, an informant, 2 corrupt Miami police officers, and a school security guard plan a drug deal.
How much stuff does she have? 2, 3 kilos? Yeah. So you're talking 3 kilos at 30,000.
One of the high prices of the illegal drug trade is a staggering amount of official corruption throughout the United States. Sergeant Pat Moyer of the U.S. Park Police in Washington, D.C.
I'd be naive to say that there wouldn't be somebody on my department that might not be involved in the drug business or giving information.
Authorities blame the estimated $60 to $140 billion drug economy. Even those who oppose legalization concede it's the illegal nature of the drug trade that generates most of the money that corrupts the officials. Richard Gregory of the Miami U.S. Attorney's Office.
They become corrupt because, as with all other criminals, they're greedy, and the narcotics trade is bringing in tremendous amounts of money.
In recent years, major drug corruption scandals have broken out in Miami, Brooklyn, even in tiny Kermit, West Virginia, where police and other officials ran a drug house right next to City Hall. Mark Schnapp, chief of the criminal division of the Miami U.S. Attorney's Office, says drug corruption no longer just involves an officer taking a bribe to look the other way.
We see the cop as the dope. We see the cop ripping off hundreds of kilos of cocaine. We see the cop, the public official that the citizen in the street has the most daily contact with is the doper.
But not all the corruption involves public officials. Lawyers, bankers, accountants, businessmen, and many others have also succumbed as the traffickers spread their wealth throughout society. Authorities say drug dealers are buying up apartment complexes, mansions, fancy cars, jewelry, ranches, even a recording studio. By investing their money in legitimate businesses, even though laws try to prevent it, traffickers hide their money and strengthen their operations.
Supporters believe legalization would rob the traffickers of most of their profits and help topple their organizations. Under this theory, it would also loosen their stranglehold on public officials and legitimate business. Mark Potter, ABC News, Miami.
This ABC News special, a national town meeting, the legalization of drugs, will continue in a moment.
Somewhere over the rain. On vacation. I didn't need.
In 1986, organized crime in the United States made $27.5 billion from the sale of narcotics. That's more than the combined profits of IBM, Exxon, Ford, General Motors, General Electric, AT&T, Philip Morris, and DuPont.
One argument for the legalization of drugs is that it would save hundreds of millions of dollars in enforcement costs. Two of our affiliated stations have examined different aspects of that story for us. First, Scott Pelley of WFAA in Dallas. Here now is that report.
Go on with that APU, Cap.
In the Arizona desert, $17 million is pulled from thin air. This is Aerostat, a new radar balloon seeking airborne drug smugglers. The multi-million-dollar investment on this site is just the beginning. Customs is planning on building 5 more of these all along the southwest border. It is an excellent example of the new high-tech, high-dollar weaponry being used in the war on drugs, a war whose costs are going literally sky high. The arsenal now includes pursuit jets, AWACS radar planes, and military helicopters. Federal cost this year, $3 billion. Local police will spend more. In Dallas and other cities, heavily armed assault teams now attack drug houses. Costs for equipment and training are soaring. This year, Dallas alone will spend more than $2 million. Nationally, enforcement costs almost $8 billion a year. If drugs were legalized, some estimate taxpayers would save 75% of that. Consider, $8 billion covers most of NASA's budget, or would cut individual federal income tax about 2%. But for now, the drug war has become an arms race with a rapidly rising tax burden. This is Scott Pelley reporting from Fort Huachuca, Arizona.
This is Peggy Lewis in Miami, where drug arrests and seizures occur almost daily in an area considered the gateway for cocaine to the rest of the nation. And the costs of the drug war move into the courts. Dexter Leighton is the U.S. Attorney for South Florida.
In this district, the majority of the criminal trials are drug trials, and the majority of all criminal cases are drug cases, and the majority of the prosecutors are working in drug matters one way or another.
The National Drug Enforcement Policy Board estimates the cost to the federal government to prosecute drug cases has gone from $44.5 million 7 years ago to $142 million today. The nation's judicial system is spending some $2 billion to prosecute and incarcerate people involved in drug-related crimes, and it's only expected to get worse as the number of crimes increase and sentences get longer. Already nationally, about 10% of the 500,000 state prison inmates are there because they violated drug laws and make up about 1/3 of the 44,000 federal prisoners. With prison and court costs expected to go even higher, those in favor of legalization argue it will cut these costs and reduce prison populations. This is Peggy Lewis in Miami.
And now we're going to be joined by an old friend and colleague of mine, the co-host of ABC's 2020, and I was interested to discover Hugh and I talked about this on the phone the other day. For some 20-odd years, you have been mulling over this problem of legalization and have come to what conclusions? And put that in context, would you?
Yeah, 20 years ago, it was just about exactly 20 years ago on the Today Show on NBC, I first explored the idea of considering both decriminalization, and I used the word legalization, of marijuana in that case. It was extremely unpopular as a view, and the roof fell in on me. Since then, in radio commentaries and twice on 2020, I've said I thought we really ought to seriously consider legalization, and I found a remarkable change in public attitudes in that 20 years. I think the public is ahead of the politicians on this one.
It's only half the roof that's going to collapse on you this time.
Less than half, a little bit the last time. Two points that I'd like to make. I have not heard opponents yet of legalization call for a return to prohibition. And one of the things that hasn't been really cited yet is the heavy total social cost of prohibition. Granted, fewer people drank then, but there were people drinking methyl alcohol instead of ethyl, going blind and dying. The rise of the rum runners and the Torrio gang and the Capone gang, who controlled whole governments in the Midwest. I see a possibility. Now, this may sound a little paranoid. If we continue to dig the same hole deeper, the Medellin cartel, for example, which already controls governments in the southern hemisphere, it's not inconceivable that that kind of lobby money and pressure could come to a man in Congress who was saying, ready to put forth a bill to legalize drugs, and say to him, we have the money to fund your opponent, and next term you won't be here in the Congress, and we can fund his campaign. If you don't back down. Now, I'm not saying this is happening, but it's not inconceivable if we continue along the same course we've been going, along with the tremendous crime.
Two issues that Mr. Downs, with all due respect, he said the American public has turned around. That's clearly not true. Your own numbers show that about 90% are against legalization today, which is more than we're against legalization.
No, I'm just saying there was a change in the response to me from when I first did it. So
but
I'm
there are
talking
still
about a trend.
more people against legalization today than a dozen years ago. That is simply not true.
May I interrupt you for just 1 second? Because those figures have not been broken down quite the way that they did. When you just isolate marijuana, for example, you'll find that roughly 25% of the American public are now in favor of legalization of marijuana. Separate that from the other drugs.
But we're not talking about just marijuana.
Well,
we're talking about drugs.
I understand. Mr. Mayor?
I believe that the reason that we have failed to control the situation is that we are not committed to everything that it takes by way of law enforcement. Japan ended drug addiction. Theirs was amphetamines. And they ended it with very stringent law enforcement. They don't have that problem. We're not willing to commit those resources. When you say $8 billion is spent on law enforcement, we would save 75%. I'd rather spend $16 billion, double it, and eliminate the drug trade rather than to save the 70%. How? I will tell you how, in my judgment. The reason that people continue to use drugs is they're not punished. I'm talking about the drug user as well as the drug pusher. Now, everybody says, oh, remember the Rockefeller days when he wanted to send everybody away for life imprisonment and juries wouldn't do it. So don't send them away for life imprisonment. How about a couple of months? How about work farms? How about making someone pay a penalty? Today, you do not pay a penalty. Now, Dr. Jaffe said something to me, and I said, why don't you say it? And he said, no, I'm a doctor, not a lawyer, so I will say it.
Well, where's it? Poor Dr. Jaffe hasn't had a chance to say anything yet.
Why don't you say it?
Let me just introduce.
I thought it was absolutely correct.
Dr. Jaffe is director of the Addiction Research Center of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, a part of the U.S. Public Health Service, and has been very quiet, and I apologize for not coming to you sooner. What was it that you said to the mayor?
I'm not sure what I said to the mayor.
On our unwillingness to apply law enforcement and all of the protections that we have built, so it becomes impossible to convict somebody. It becomes impossible to convict somebody without spending $70,000. That's ridiculous what we've done to ourselves.
That's a great statement, Dr. Jaffe.
And you said it so well, too. Go ahead, Dr. Jaffe, I'm sorry.
Well, I think the mayor is right that the user is the key to demand. And that at some point, there's an inconsistency in saying a law-abiding citizen who only uses an illicit drug. Even the single act of using occasionally contributes to this thing that we call the drug problem. And at some point, the penalties do not have to be draconian. But the probability has to be high enough to impress people with the likelihood that there will be an adverse effect.
Like parking tickets.
Like a parking ticket when the people are doing their job. But there are ways to do this. We're doing it now, and we did it once when we faced a situation. It was a number of years ago, but I think Chairman Rangel, Mayor Koch was they were in Congress at the time, but we did have a situation in which we couldn't control the flow of heroin into Vietnam. And at that point, it looked almost hopeless. Nobody said, let's legalize it and tell the Viet Cong to bring in more. It was a catastrophe. And the real issue was, how do you create a situation in which you change the attitude of the users? They happened to be armed with M16s at the time. The point was that we instituted a situation in which the penalties weren't draconian, but we tested. We found when there was drug use that people went into a program.
Let me just turn to one of our lawyers.
And it had an impact.
Alan,
it reduced the...
I'd like to know how you punish a homeless addict, how you punish a jobless addict that's out there in the street to teach him a lesson for abusing drugs.
I'll tell you one thing you could do, Charlie, and that is you can take him out of the environment, as the mayor suggests, and have work camps that may be punishment to some people, but have treatment facilities, are separate from the environment in which he was committed to crime.
Would you settle for homes and jobs, maybe, as an initial step?
May I just...
Could you start with that?
Gentlemen,
trying to see what makes people jobs.
For the sake, hold it, Mr. Mayor, for the sake of our radio audience, let me at least identify the combatants here. The last voice you heard was that of Mayor Ed Koch, William Von Raab, and Charles Rangel. Now, go ahead, Mayor Koch.
Very briefly, homes and jobs will not do it. When Dr. Thornton talked about the community, I didn't want to get involved in saying, listen, that's 60 rhetoric. It is not a question of the community. It is a question of sanctions. It is a question of paying a penalty. Rich people are on drugs. They have homes and jobs. The fact is that people take drugs not because they're poor.
Ed, I'm asking, how do you punish the tens of thousands? Let me finish, please. Sure. I'm not Dr. Jaffe. Yeah. Listen, how do you punish the tens of thousands of homeless people that are sleeping in the street and they're on drugs, and you go up to them and say, I'm the chief executive officer of the city of New York. I want to teach you a lesson.
I will tell you how you do
the law.
it.
Tell me what you do.
You give sentences of 30 days or 60 days.
They want it.
No, they don't want
Take
it.
them off the
come
street.
on.
Give them
They do not want to go to work camps.
Do you know what will happen to the prison population of this country?
Alan Dershowitz.
Do you know what will happen to the prison?
Hold on just a second. Alan Dershowitz, then we got to go to a break, and we'll come back to you, Ms. Thornton, and Dr. Thornton.
We will have 10 million people in jail.
Alan, how did Japan do it?
Japan is a law-abiding country which doesn't have the guts to have an immigration policy that is like ours, which didn't have a problem of slavery, which didn't have the social ills we have. Don't make comparisons. If you want to start putting casual users in jail, we're going to have more jails than we're going to have law offices and business offices and politicians.
I don't believe it. The penalty will depend upon how casual.
But do you know what happens to the civil liberties in a society when you start making criminals? That's right, I care about civil liberties,
I do
Mayor.
too.
I care
about the civil liberties of society.
And
so
the fact
do
I.
Well, I'm not so sure,
Alan. I want to stop the victimization of innocent people who have not chosen to use drugs.
Drug users
and the answer
are
is
not
not to
victims.
put people in jail.
They are abusers.
Reverend Jackson, thank you very much. You're the only man on this panel who could have done that. We have to take a break, but we'll be back in just a moment.
The legalization of drugs continues in a moment.
AT&T.
Cocaine, known as coke, is a drug extracted from the leaves of the coca plant. The drug, a white powder, is usually snorted, but it is also smoked, a technique known as freebasing, and it can be injected. Crack is cocaine, which has been chemically altered so it can be easily smoked. Cocaine seems to stimulate electrical activity in an area of the brain associated with pleasure. The cocaine high, or rush, produces a sense of euphoria, energy, and alertness. The high is immediate, but disappears within an hour and may be followed by a crash involving depression, fatigue, and tension. Cocaine causes the blood vessels to narrow, making the heart beat faster and work harder. Uncommonly, but unpredictably, cocaine causes an irregular heartbeat and can trigger sudden heart attacks, even in common doses in users with apparently healthy hearts. Chronic use can cause insomnia, brain seizures, strokes, and severe paranoia. Cocaine does not produce physical dependence with withdrawal symptoms, but it can cause severe psychological cravings. Crack produces the most dramatic cocaine high since the drug reaches the brain almost instantly. It is therefore highly addictive.
Just a few minutes ago, Mayor Koch made reference to the sort of drug culture of the 1960s. Many Americans consider the 60s, in fact, the heyday of drug use and drug abuse in this country. But what did the heroes of the counterculture then think about what's happening now? Here's that report.
Coming into Los Angeles, bringing in a couple of keys.
The whole world of what I call the cultural revolution that happened here in this country was partially dependent upon seeing things from another point of view. And drugs induce those other points of view. I say, if you're going to do it, and you can't ban it, let's legalize it and keep the same people who are doing it. Give them a legitimate job. Tax them. Make some money from it.
I mean, we really believed that marijuana was going to transform America. We felt if Richard Nixon would only get stoned on marijuana, he'd immediately make a phone call and bring all the troops back from Vietnam. Marijuana and heroin and cocaine are destroying the youth of America today. And the only way I legalize it is if every single penny was spent on a nonstop educational campaign on television to get people not to do drugs.
The entire narcotics bureaucracy has always been corrupt and always been in cahoots with organized crime, and there has never been a real war on drugs. And the only way you get a war on drugs is if you actually legalize them. That would collapse the entire economic nexus, which is the center of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with us Crosby, Stills, Nash.
They told us it would lead to harder stuff, and we all said, no way. You know, not a chance. You know, I'm not going to do that stuff. And I did. It did do that to a lot of us. I couldn't bring myself to say, no, go ahead and legalize it, because I don't want, as a matter of fact, I more than don't want, I would be raging mad at anybody that wanted to make it possible for my 12-year-old, 13-year-old daughter to go down and buy heroin at the drugstore.
They died because it was illegal. They died because they didn't know what they were getting. I think we should legalize certain drugs, and I would legalize heroin, I would legalize cocaine, but not crack, and I would certainly legalize marijuana, because failing to legalize, and particularly heroin, has made a lot of people on the streets into animals.
Amnesty, yes. Clemency, no.
Before we get into the debate of legal or illegal, we should increase the education. Because once you legalize it, you're not going to solve the problem. Our body's going to get immune to it.
Go back to the laboratories and give us a psychedelic drug that doesn't have any negative side effects.
If and when, and it will happen very soon, the younger generation coming into power decriminalizes cocaine, makes it a prescription drug with the licensing and protections and labels on the package and instruction manuals as to how not to abuse it, the abuse will go way down, and in one day, the criminal apparatus and empire will stop.
Mr. Customs Man. We don't have to do it forever, you know, just try it, see what happens.
All right, some voices from the past and the present. Sir, you have a question or a comment from Mayor Concha.
Yes, I'm a product of New York. I was born and raised in the Bronx. I'm an ex-con at the time for the state of New York, 1983. I've been to just about every secular program you have here, drug program, methadone maintenance programs. They didn't seem to work, Mr. Mayor. A lot of these mental health so-called programs didn't work. My urge to use drugs got bigger and bigger, such as in the methadone case where I strayed to cocaine. As far as prison is concerned, I went in and out of prisons. I never really got rehabilitated, quote unquote. The first day I would get out of prisons, I'd go back to my heroin and cocaine use. Right now, I'm at Transformation Life Center. I'm going to tell you what worked for me. God, Jesus Christ, worked in my life and changed my life. I have to praise God that I'm standing here alive today. Number one, I like to see more of the church in the cities get involved with this drug problem, the community itself. It's a personal thing. It starts at the family level in our communities. Number two, I'm going to approach you with this question because it wasn't too long ago that I was at what you call a shooting gallery. And I seeked help to one of your city programs, drug programs. I don't want to call a name. And there's a long list, a long waiting list for many people that need help out there that can't get into drug programs. People don't have Medicaids. I myself don't have Medicaids. It took a church, Manhattan Bible Church, to take me in off the streets. I appreciate that. My question is, where all these answers, where is all this money going to? I mean, where the rubber meets the road, that's what I would like to know, how we can help
I'll tell you.
people. You know, I mean, I see a lot of people here very stagnant, very comfortable, but we really have to reach out to a lot of people, you know, be personally involved. As far as the legalization is concerned, I think that's totally wrong. I mean, I wouldn't like my son or my daughter to get drug addicted because of the government making it easy. These are things that we all have to come to an agreement with, and it's really affected my family, and I praise the Lord that I'm here speaking to you right now.
You raised a question of Mayor Koch.
Very simply.
Treatment centers.
The city of New York does not provide or fund for treatment centers. We do the law enforcement, and the state has the obligation of providing treatment centers. Regrettably, they have not provided the numbers needed. Only 35,000 addicts, and there are 200,000 heroin addicts in the city. Only 35,000 are in treatment.
Capital of the
now,
world.
the federal government, since it is responsible for allowing cocaine and heroin to come into the country, cannot be grown in Central Park, they should be providing treatment on demand. Some folks would say, well, why doesn't the city do it? Because if the city did it, then we wouldn't have money for all of our other services. We don't ask the state or the federal government to provide the more than $1 billion that we're spending on cops and our more than $2 billion on health and hospital services. And so we, the city, cannot take on that obligation. But you're absolutely right. There should be treatment on demand. I'm for that. Now, when you said that everything else didn't work for you, but religion did, that's terrific. That's like Alcoholics Anonymous is a form of religion. You went directly to the church.
All right.
When did the city stop doing drug rehab?
In 1979, the state took over that obligation.
I know, but still, the city always had drug rehabilitation programs.
In 1979, the city used to also pay for the subway system, Charlie, and the city used to pay for CUNY University. Those obligations were taken over by the state.
I know, but the way you said it as though we were banned, that the state, that we take care of the police and the state.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But if we wanted, we could provide
and then you'd have to provide. Then you would have.
No, I'm just wondering.
There's a limited pot of money.
From providing
Charlie,
it,
there's a limited pot of money. And if you say that we have to spend the money on drug treatment and it isn't the state or the federal government, then we will spend less in other areas.
Mr. Mayor, forgive me. I want to try and move this thing around a little bit. Dr. Shirley Thornton first, and Jesse Jackson.
I want to get back
Dr.
to a
Thornton.
statement you made earlier, Dr. Koch. You said it's, Mayor, that you mentioned the whole topic about the 60s and the rhetoric of the 60s. Right. I'm sorry that you believe communities working in concert with agencies cannot solve their problems. I'm not talking about having people come in and bring money and take away programs as they begin to work. I am saying that agencies within communities have to come together, hopefully with a mayor in charge, working with other department heads and community-based organizations and churches and everything else that is said to address the schools and all those issues.
You were saying that the answer is to be found in the community.
That is exactly what I am saying that communities, when empowered to make differences in their lives, can make. That means schools.
That's rhetoric.
That means schools that are working. That means communities. I drove through this city today, and there was enough work with filth to put a whole lot of people to work if we wanted to give jobs.
Well, I understand that. The fact is, just so you'll know, there isn't a single person in this city who can't get a job if they want a job at even above minimum wage. Many people do not want to take jobs, so you should know that.
Well, then the next thing, I will personally bring you a book that deals with culture and drugs to look at maybe the misalignment of culture has become the problems of where we're going today.
Dr. Thornton, let me go to Mr. Jackson again, and then we're going to go to a break. Go ahead.
A couple of instances, the matter of religion has come up. Beside the issue of the supply of drugs and the demand for drugs is the deeper issue of the craving. What is it that drugs are trying to satisfy? What gap in our meaning are they addressing? In other words, is some combination of mindless materialism for some people and abounding poverty and hopelessness for others are being addressed with drugs as an anesthesia for their pain. Because if we try to isolate the addicted community to a certain group of quote-unquote junkies who have a certain kind of profile, it may miss my experience. I visit, Ted, as you know, about 4 elementary or high schools a week from September to June. And quick, if I ask those children, usually 3,000 to 5,000, suburb, inner city, how many of you know someone in your classroom, in your school, your class age, who's dead because of drugs? Usually about 25% stand. You know someone in your age group who is in jail because of drugs? Usually about 60% stand. You know someone in your age group who has tried drugs? Usually about 90% stand. From Pasadena to Seattle, Washington, all across the country. And lastly, you know someone who has contemplated suicide. Never fewer than 60% of our children stand. So quite apart from supply and military and demand, is there something else that we must address within our culture? And I hope that we will not dismiss the crisis in meaning and not just focus on money and drugs, which are really the kind of out of the dimensions of it.
We, in fact, are going to focus on another factor that no one has yet mentioned, and that is that there tends to be kind of a cyclical nature to what happens, and we sometimes have a way of forgetting that the kind of thing that we're involved in right now, this drug addiction, this epidemic in the United States, it is not the first time it has happened. You may be interested to learn that just almost exactly 100 years ago, we went through a very similar kind of national addiction. We will focus on that when we come back after this break.
Live from New York, a national town meeting on the legalization of drugs will continue in a moment.
You can see the dream of success in the eyes of people all across America. At Citicorp, we understand the dream. That's why, as Citicorp and Citibank, we've become America's largest.
Years of her life to swimming. In the '84 Olympics, she won a silver medal. She knows the value of a good investment. She invests in U.S. savings bonds.
While the Soviets race into space, America flounders. Now the whole story of why will be told. A special program, Beyond the Shuttle, Sunday.
This special edition of Nightline, the legalization of drugs, is brought to you by AT&T.
Drug use has a long, and it must be added sometimes forgotten history in this country, a history that in fact predates our establishment as a nation. Here now is this report.
The first drug epidemic in American history was tobacco. Tobacco was well established before the first explorers and colonists came to this country. The Native American Indian population were using it. The American tobacco industry was strong enough to finance the American Revolution, and it financed a lot of the early wars. So our country has always been involved, intimately involved, with cultivation of drugs and the use of drugs. The Civil War really popularized the use of morphine. And it changed a lot of the habits because in the Civil War we had the introduction of the hypodermic syringe, which allowed the soldiers to be injected directly with morphine to alleviate the pain of their battlefield wounds.
Well, you can see where
giving someone a hypodermic syringe and a bottle of morphine for a chronic pain would lead to a lot of difficulty. And many people became very addicted to these substances. But actually, the use of opium and morphine was rising rapidly prior to the Civil War, and it continued on rising up until about the mid-1890s. We were the only Western nation to have no national laws controlling narcotics in the 19th century. And you can see what happened with drugs in the 19th century because we had a free economy in narcotics, a complete free enterprise. You could get morphine or you could get cocaine by mail order. Pure cocaine, the white powder, didn't really become commercially available until about 1884. And within 1 year, Park Davis Company could give you cocaine in something like 14 different forms. Cocaine was seen as a wonderful tonic for the body and for the mind. In the late 1880s, the Hay Fever Association in America adopted cocaine as their official remedy. You could also get Coca cordial, Coca wine. Well, now, how did Coca-Cola come in? Well, Coca-Cola was a temperance drink. Coca wine without alcohol. Instead of wine, it was seltzer water. So that you could get the benefits of coca and extracts of coca and of cocaine, but alcohol would not touch your lips. So again, we go back to the notion that in the introductory phase of these substances, people think they're good.
Cocaine habits, mighty bad. It's the worst old habit that I ever had.
But we were also starting to see the first signs of abuse. Patients were coming in with problems. Physicians were seeing more and more complaints of cocaine overdoses and cocaine poisoning. And the reason for that is that the preparations over the counter became stronger and stronger.
But the way I love my coke is a doggone sin.
The first drug confession of a cocaine user was written in 1902. And that was really the signpost of trouble to come.
The use of morphine seemed to be declining from that period on, and I suspect that cocaine also was starting to decline because of the fear among the American people about these substances. That resulted in the first international treaty to control opium and cocaine in the world, the Hague Opium Convention in 1912. Their idea was very similar to what's exactly the same as it is our policy now. That is, if the other countries of the world where this stuff is grown and manufactured brought it under control, then there wouldn't be any smuggling into the United States and our problem would be gone.
And it took some more strict legislation in 1914, the Harrison Act, to actually proclaim for all practical purposes that these drugs were prohibited. And that really curtailed a lot of the use, but use only went underground.
I gotta have dope. I'm a hophead. I'd sell my soul for just one shot.
What happened in our country was that the whole memory of this earlier drug epidemic faded away, and knowledge about drugs faded. So now, when we go back and you say, what happened between 1950 and 1960, one of the things you can say is you had had by that time 1 or 2 generations of Americans who knew almost nothing about drugs.
She don't lie, she don't lie, she don't lie. Cocaine.
You had a shift of attitude toward these drugs. These drugs were starting to be seen as helpful, just like they were back in the 1870s and 1880s. What we're dealing with now is a second drug epidemic in our society. It takes decades before people turn around and realize they don't want to take a chance on some of these drugs. It's just too dangerous to do that.
Fascinating, isn't it? We're going to take another break. When we come back, we're going to take some phone calls, and we will go back, of course, to our distinguished panel. All of that in a moment.
Digging a tunnel to find a hole, digging a tunnel to find a hole, digging a tunnel to find a hole.
Jill, can I be honest with you? without you taking offense.
Sure.
Kip is a nothing. He's a nobody. And he has no future. He's just using you. I really don't understand what you two have in common. Is it the bed thing? You could do a lot better. Yeah, ever since last summer, you seem lost. I don't know. You just changed.
What do you mean?
I mean that you used to be so independent. Damn it, Jill. You were the most promising girl in class. We all looked up to you. Now it just seems so disappointing.
Excuse me.
Dig. In sports. With our telephone hookups, but we do have a couple of calls now from parts of the country other than Iowa. We have one call now from Clemson, South Carolina. Go ahead. Was that yelp one of surprise, or is that all we're going to get out of you? Clemson,
no,
can you
I
hear
would
me?
like to bring up the point that if drug use was legalized, then the content of those drugs could be regulated, and therefore the drugs would be safer than they are on the streets today, and hopefully some lives would be saved.
All right, let's go to Mayor Schmoke, who has been very patiently waiting to rejoin us in Baltimore. Mr. Mayor?
Well, Ted, I just wanted to emphasize one point, that I think that many people think that our policy should be a totally drug-free America. And that would be a nice goal, but I think it's about as realistic as seeking a alcohol-free America back in the 20s. It won't happen. We've got to figure out how we control this disease of addiction, how we control the crime associated with the trafficking in drugs. And I think that we ought to come up with different solutions other than the ones that we're pursuing now, and that's why the decriminalization debate should continue, and hopefully tonight will spark more debate.
Ted,
what about
a strategy to increase the number of addicts?
Now, what about reduce the crime in the streets?
If you legalize the drugs, you're going to increase the availability and the number of addicts, and therefore you're going to shift the population.
Gentlemen, I've got to have one of you talking at a time. Make your point.
I'm sorry,
Reverend Jackson, and then Mr. Mayor.
You're going to shift the basic population from jails to hospitals, and
well,
there must
isn't
be.
Isn't it better to treat these people, the addict population, as patients rather than criminals?
Number one, it's going to cost much more. But worse than that, to have a generation of young people coming onto the market with legal access to that which they should be discouraged from expands the crisis. It does not contract.
Let me just ask you very quickly, Congressman Rangel, Mr. Mayor, if you'd hold on just a second, please. No one has yet addressed the question. Let's try and do that quickly and get a couple more calls in. Congressman Rangel, the business about quality control, strange as it may sound, I mean, one of the dangers of drugs that are kind of passed out on the streets is there's absolutely no quality control.
Let me make it clear, Ted, that none of the advocates have ever said how they got to deal with any of the questions I raise as it relates to the distribution of legalization. Now, I know the mayor is going to address this on the 29th in Washington, and I know he wants a special committee of experts to handle it. But if you're saying that you got to give quality drugs for an addict, what do you think we're talking about? An addict who just wants a shot of quality drugs one time? He wants to get high. And when you finish with the quality, he's going back into the street to get what he needs to get high. Addicts don't go in for drugs as though someone goes in just for a cocktail in the afternoon and that satisfy it.
But you make
so
it sound
I think
like
it's a lot of poppycock to say that you're going to give clean drugs to a person unless you got to say, I'm going to give him as clean and as high a purity as he wants for as long as he wants.
You make it sound like drugs are really illegal today. Drugs are freely and completely available in every city in this country today. All we want to do is get some of the advantages of decriminalization. And
what
that is
advantage?
Hospitalization,
what advantage, Alan?
Treatment facilities,
Alan,
purity
what
of drugs,
advantage is there to
clean
legalize?
needles,
Robert Stuckman
and
of the
being able to say
Alan,
morally,
what
don't
what
use the
advantage
drug.
is there to legalizing?
There's overwhelming advantages.
Ethan,
there's overwhelming, look, there's overwhelming advantages to legalization. Right now,
Ethan,
what is it, over
Ethan,
50? No,
you cannot show me one bit of empirical data.
Over 50%. I can show you tons of empirical
Ethan,
data.
banging the table doesn't impress me.
Over 50%.
You cannot show one bit of empirical data that says, number one, Ethan,
you
will you let me
can show
finish?
Tremendous empirical data over, look, Bob, every statement you made the first time you spoke was factually incorrect. I could go back and correct those things.
There is not one bit of empirical data that shows that if we legalize, less people will use, number one, or that if we legalize, our crime problem will go down.
There is overwhelming evidence with respect to the second. Overwhelming evidence with respect to the second. It's just
Gentlemen, may I just make one point here, which is as long as two or more of you speak at the same time, we can't hear any one of you.
But this guy's asleep.
Hold on just a second. Well, there may be some folks who are going to sleep right now.
Can I just respond to the point in that case?
I'll tell you what. Let me just let Mayor Schmoke respond one more time. Then we're going to go do a call in Fort Myers. Then we're going to take another break, and then we'll come back to all of you, and we will kind of wrap up this evening's discussion. Mayor Schmoke?
I just wanted to emphasize that when the gentleman from DEA is talking about the overwhelming empirical evidence, the overwhelming empirical evidence shows that our law enforcement approach has failed, and it will continue to fail.
As long as we only depend on a law enforcement approach, you're right. However, the antithesis to that is not necessarily giving everything to anybody that wants it. There's an in-between ground.
And without law enforcement.
All right, Dr. Mitch Rosenthal, who really has not had a chance to say much this evening, go ahead, and then we're going to go to Fort Myers.
Without law enforcement, we're not going to see people come into treatment. Mr. Dershowitz has raised the point that if we took law enforcement away, if we gave away drugs, we would medicalize this problem and we'd make it more humane and people would come into treatment. The fact is, we don't see people come into treatment on their own. They come into treatment generally because someone is forcing them to come into treatment. A wife is saying, look, I'm going to divorce you if you don't come into treatment. A judge is saying, I'm going to put you in jail if you don't come into treatment. A father is saying, I'm not going to bail you out another time unless you come into treatment. Congressman Rangel hit it right on the head. He said addicts want to take drugs. And what will happen with any move towards legalization is people will move to more and more and more drug use. And with more and more drug use, there is more and more erosion of character and more criminal behavior and more terrible consequences on children and on families and on the rest of us.
You know, if you'd hang in for just a minute, incredible as it may seem, I'm going to have to warn our affiliates and also our radio affiliates that we're going to go a little beyond our allotted time, which was 1:30, so that we have one more segment in which we can take a couple more calls, allow everyone to sort of summarize what we have been trying to get to this evening, and then we'll bid you all a fond good night, but we're going to take a break.
Hey, Moneybags, think it was really necessary to buy an Amana refrigerator?
Yeah, our veg fund, absolutely free. Pleasant Hawaiian holidays. See your travel agent or call 1-800-2-HAWAII.
Well, my daughter was going off to college and I was anxious. What if she needed something? In an emergency?
Narcotics, tranquilizers, barbiturates, and amphetamines are among the legal prescription drugs which are often abused as street drugs. Narcotics are prescribed for pain relief, but abusers use them to feel dreamy and content. Narcotics depress brain activity and slow body functions. Codeine and brand-name drugs such as Percodan are popular on the street. Barbiturates and tranquilizers produce tranquil, calm feelings and are prescribed for their effect on mood and for conditions such as insomnia and epilepsy. These drugs also slow brain activity and body functions. On the street, they are known as downers, with brand names including Valium and Seconal. Amphetamines produce feelings of energy, elation, and focus, but users can also develop anxiety and insomnia. Amphetamines stimulate brain activity. They are rarely prescribed today, but are frequently sought for weight loss and to fight fatigue. On the street, amphetamines are known as uppers or speed, with brand names including Dexedrine. These prescription drugs are habit-forming, and overdoses, especially in combination with alcohol, can kill.
And we go back to our phones, and yet another phone call not from Iowa, Fort Myers. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Go ahead, sir.
All right, everybody knows there's two choices, but the question is implementation. What are you going to do when you make a choice? People speak of a drug war, but they don't want to fight it like a war. If it's a war, if Colombia wants to kill our kids, kill theirs. Bomb them. on a level with people. If a pusher wants to kill your kids, kill the pusher. If you don't want to act like it's a war, if you want to accept it and make it legal, then make it legal in one area where they can all go, so that the American people who don't want this stuff in their lives don't have to deal with it.
Who wants to pick up on that? Hugh Downs, go ahead.
Yeah, I keep hearing those opposing legalization seem to imply that it automatically carries with it the availability to everyone of everything at any time and so forth. I would not be in favor of legalization if I thought that a 13-year-old child could go into the drugstore and buy it. And as a thought experiment, imagine, liquor is under the law now. The hard drugs are not, the illicit drugs. Imagine a 12-year-old child in a community where the easiest thing in the world for him to do now is to get cocaine. And cocaine, incidentally, drugs are available to everyone now. But imagine that this child says, I don't want to do drugs. I want to have liquor. And I don't think he could find a bootlegger in all of greater New York. He'd have to go into a liquor store or a bar, and they wouldn't serve him.
Oh, except he'd find an older brother or an older friend just to go in for him and get it.
But a kid can't go into a liquor store or a bar and get served.
No, but I mean, it's easy enough to find someone else to get it for you.
Oh, well, always, sure.
But
You
know what I'd like to control? I've been asking everyone that's been just willing to debate, because I know no one is advocating legalization. I've learned that. Everyone wants to have an
only
open
politicians,
mind,
only politicians don't advocate
please,
it.
come
We
on,
who don't
doctor,
run for
please
office
give me a
really
break.
do advocate.
You don't run for anything. Listen, I'm asking you. You say that the 13-year-old can't get it, as though you have some scheme as to who can get it. Would you have to be an addict to get it?
No, anybody. My point is, anybody can get drugs now.
I'm asking, under legalization, would the pharmacist be able to give it? Would you have to go to a doctor to get it?
No, wouldn't he be able to do the same kind of thing as with liquor and determine somebody's age or ask for an ID card?
You're asking me
There'd
questions.
Be some control.
I'm asking what kind of control would it be? It's a simple question.
It wouldn't bring utopia.
No.
We still have problems with alcohol.
It'll be bad control, but what kind of
Congressman
control?
Rangel, you've got a volunteer over here who wants to answer your question.
Great.
Ethan Nadelman.
Thank you, Congressman Rangel.
Oh, my God.
I think you have some wonderful questions.
I thought it was really going to be an answer, but I tell you, he promised it'll be interesting.
Congressman, I think one of the big problems with drug policy in recent years has been the fact that you play such a prominent role in formulating it. Now, the bottom line, there's a lot of different options. As I said before, when we look at which drugs we want to legalize, how far we want to go, who we want to make it available to. The thing is, Congressman, the policy that you support right now is one in which the drug dealers supply it, not the government or legitimate tax-paying private parties.
Now that's
the system,
your answer.
Hold on a
That's your
second.
answer to my question,
the system
right?
you support.
I asked you how would you regulate legalization, and I promised that you wouldn't give an answer, and you consistently
you'll get an
avoiding
answer.
it.
You'll get an answer.
He
You
did.
only got 20 to 2.
No, Dr. Nadelman, he's right on this one, Professor Nadelman. He did ask you a specific question, and you've answered something you didn't ask.
No, I agree with you, Ted. But the important thing, I will answer that question. But I think it's very important to put the thing in perspective.
Well, I'll tell you what.
Let's put it this way.
Let's take the perspective. Let's take the perspective afterwards. I'm as interested in hearing the answer to Congressman Rangel's question as he is.
Okay.
And we don't have a whole lot of time left.
I would think that the first thing to do would be to make marijuana legally available. And fairly readily available.
To everyone?
To adults, yeah. Well, we know right now, like alcohol or tobacco, but with stricter controls. Hold on a second. We know right now that 60 million Americans in this country have smoked marijuana. Between 20 and 30 million are smoking it right now. We have 0 overdose deaths. We know that the vast majority of people who have smoked marijuana have not gone on to harder drugs. Last week, the administrative judge of the DEA, in a suit which asked whether or not marijuana should be made legally available for medical purposes to deal with chemotherapy.
What happened to crack cocaine and heroin?
The polite thing to do would be to let me at least finish what I'm saying.
You'll be for legalizing cigarettes soon.
Everybody on this panel who's opposed to legalization is opposed to legalizing marijuana. Now, marijuana, the DEA judge said that compared in toxicity to aspirin, marijuana is overwhelmingly safer. He said that marijuana is perhaps one of the most safest psychoactive substances ever known to man. Now,
that's very simply.
Everybody
when Mayor Koch talks about throwing users into jail.
Listen, don't all start waking up now. The program's almost over here.
Well, you didn't call me before, Ted.
Everybody
when Mayor Koch
believes
says that 60
that
million
the drugs
Americans
that have to be addressed now are cocaine and heroin and crack. And when we've addressed those, even though most of us believe that marijuana ought to not be legalized, that's the last one on the list.
No, he didn't answer.
He has done
Ted, can I answer the congressman's question specifically?
Ted, it's the first one.
The reason for
you start with marijuana. Marijuana of all the illicit drugs is the safest.
May I just make an observation? When Bach wrote a fugue, it was beautiful. When you guys try to do it, it doesn't work at all. We've got to have one theme at a time, and then when you finish, we'll move on to the next person. Hold it. Just all of you hold it 1 second. The gentleman behind you who was yelling. What were you yelling about?
My name is Dana Beal.
I don't care what your name is. What were you yelling about?
Okay. The exact quote from the federal judge was the safest therapeutically active substance known to mankind. That means safer than caffeine, safer than aspirin. That means you're putting people in jail for basically doing something that's completely harmless.
Let me turn to
How
Dr.
can you talk about locking people up in work camps? How can you talk about taking people's homes away from them, evicting people in New York City?
All right.
Why do you want to
just 1 second.
How can you justify?
I may have made a.
How can you justify a situation where you've eliminated pot, but crack and heroin are 4 times more available, 4 times cheaper than at the beginning of the Reagan war on drugs?
1 second.
All you've done is design
a
system that gets rid of marijuana. Leaving our drugs.
Okay.
That's all you've done. And that's the DEA.
Hold it. I would like, Mr. Mayor, if I may, just for 1 moment, what I'd like to do, if we can cut that mic over there for a minute now. Dr. Jaffe, you are one of our most distinguished legal experts here. We have Dr. Johnson on the other side, but I'd like to address the question to you. When that judge, I must confess, I didn't read the decision. I read reports of the judge's decision. True? Marijuana, really the safest? What was the phrase? Therapeutic drug? The safest therapeutic drug?
The safest therapeutically active substance known to humankind.
All right. What do you think, Dr. Jaffe?
I think it's nonsense. I mean, I've never thought of marijuana as the safest therapeutic substance known to man. It just simply won't stand up to a critical analysis.
Ted, you said Dr. Jaffe. You said Dr. Jaffe was a legal expert.
Not a legal expert.
He's the
medical expert.
He's the leading.
Did I say legal?
He's the leading psychopharmacologist in the United States.
Ted, let's bring this down to the bottom line.
I'd also like to say on this issue of marijuana that 13% of the adolescents, kids 14 to 19 who come into Phoenix House, 13% of them have had their lives unraveled with marijuana use.
Because that's because the government lies to them about it.
It is a serious drug for a lot of people.
That's because the government says it's as dangerous as heroin and cocaine.
Alan, the government hasn't said that for 30 years.
I promise you,
as much as cocaine.
Alan Dershowitz, hold on 1 second. I promise you, if you want to stay here, we'll let you have the room for free after we get off the air, and you can talk all you want. We have got to bring this thing to a conclusion. I have found, just 1 second, I have found that when it comes to issues like this, that my old friend Dr. Tim Johnson has a way of doing it in a rather sane and down-the-middle fashion. What do you think is going to happen in this country? Do you think that we ever will legalize drugs? Any of them? All of them? Wrap it up for us, would you?
I think the word legalization implies too much moral abdication to the drug problem to ever become politically acceptable in this country. But I do feel that we're going to have to find some of the middle ground that Mr. Stutman started to allude to in between a pure criminal approach on the one hand or a legalization approach on the other that involves more emphasis on the medical therapeutic model and less emphasis on the criminal punishment model. That'll have to be done very carefully and very selectively But obviously, the extremes in most instances don't work. I don't think they'll work in this. We do have to try to find that middle ground, and I hope this debate can lead to that kind of discussion someday.
Well, Congressman Rangel made the observation a few moments ago, and I think he was right. It is terribly easy for those of us who want to promote or stimulate this kind of discussion to talk only about the debate. It takes a certain level of courage to come down on either side of this issue. I remind you that the good congressman is going to be holding hearings on the subject of legalization. I know I, for one, will be following the result of those hearings with great interest, and I trust that, and indeed hope, that those of you who have been watching this program tonight will also be focusing additional interest on it now. It is a subject that deserves more discussion, as I said at the outset of this broadcast, and I hope you feel that there has been some small contribution. In any event, I want to thank all of the distinguished members of our panel for joining us this evening, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, those of you who tried to call in, and those of you who've been listening on ABC Radio. It was good of you to join us too, and I thank all of you very much and wish you good night.
Ford profiles in quality. And summer TV fare got you spooked.
Mother's had a facelift.
Watch the Emmy-winning Hooperman.
Oh.
After Growing Pains and Head of the Class Wednesday.
Transcript of this program, send $5 to The Koppel Report. Journal Graphics, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007. The legalization of drugs, a national town meeting, has been a presentation of ABC News.